In his previous life, he was just a nameless mercenary captain born too low to ever reach the top. No talent, no status, no future, no matter how hard he fought. But after dying, he wakes up as the third son of the Grand Duke himself. This time, he finally has everything he lacked before: noble blood, insane talent, and endless resources. Armed with the experience of a hardened mercenary, he begins climbing toward the peak of the world once again. What happens when a man who once had nothing is suddenly given everything? A mercenary who never dies in battle is cheap, and the only reason he gets paid so much is because he's willing to die for his master. The only problem is, the protagonist has to listen to this nonsense every day, but it can't be helped. Such is the fate of a mercenary. He glanced at the battlefield and said that aristocrats are all sickeningly predictable. When they're needed, they promise land, even titles, but then they go back on their word, making up all sorts of excuses. He turned to his employer and said that what he'd just said was even more surprising than all that. He must have misheard. He's right, right? The commander-in-chief said he heard right. He'd just told him to die. He smirked and asked if his memory had really failed him. Had he forgotten who he was? The commander-in-chief told him he hadn't forgotten. He was Jake, the mercenary captain. He laughed and noted that it seemed he knew who he was, saying this. The man said he didn't know he could joke, and Jake reached for the dagger on his belt and said that it was clear it wasn't an order. Otherwise, why would he ask a pathetic mercenary to die with honor in battle, as if he were some kind of noble knight? The man said that perhaps he had expressed himself too bluntly, and he apologized if he had misled him. He only wanted to entrust him with one last task. He himself knew that after a series of defeats, their collapse had become inevitable. In the end, the blades of the traitors turned against the defenders of these lands. They were already at the throat of the Crawford family, and there was nowhere left to run. MC sighed and said that given the state of affairs, he understood everything perfectly well, and thought that it looked like it was time for him to run. A man whose talent was unmatched in the Empire was saying such things. If he was so pressed, then things must be bad. And yet, for an aristocrat, he was quite reasonable. It was a shame it all turned out this way. And yet, this was his last mission in such chaos. He wanted him to scout out an escape route. If that was all, he'd consider it his last job before his payday. The commander-in-chief had said the mission was simple. Tomorrow, those traitors would launch a full-scale attack. Let him be by his side and hold them back, even if only for a moment, until their lord hid somewhere safe. And if that didn't work, let him hold out until he died. He'd give him the rest of the payment at the end. A stone that size would be more than enough to maintain a force for 3 years. Jake knocked the stone out of his hands in a rage, and he asked what that meant. He replied that he should be the one asking. Did he really think he was an idiot just because he smiled all the time? He just wanted to use them as a human shield. Even if they helped, they wouldn't last long. He's wasting them just to buy his lord some time to escape. Even if they miraculously hold out, what then? He thinks that idiots will just let them go? The commander-in-chief pointed out that they were mercenaries, not knights. The enemy knows this, and as soon as he dies, the army will scatter. MC exclaimed with a smile that that's exactly how it is. That's how their business works. But he understands everything perfectly well, right? For these monsters, their squad is just a sworn enemy whom they will get rid of without hesitation, and all because of their methods. When the enemy squad found their comrades killed in battle, and they found one survivor, their commander waved his hand, ordering the knight to check on him. And as soon as he approached him, Jake, who was pretending to be wounded, plunged his blade into his neck. The knights realized it was a trap. They weren't allies, they were mercenaries from the Fang Squad. After that, all the mercenaries, who had been lying there pretending to be dead, attacked them, and their commander exclaimed, "So they're dressed in the armor of their fallen soldiers? They have no honor." MC immediately beheaded him and asked, "What honor?" He then told the commander-in-chief that he'd already cut off the heads of several commanders. He must understand that this was the only way they'd survived until today. Right now, these idiots were far more eager to tear them to pieces than to get to his lord. Seeing no reaction, he asked, did he really expect that? That they would divert all attention to themselves? The commander-in-chief firmly said that he'd better focus on completing the task. Otherwise, he'd have no choice but to kill him and take command of the squad. There was no other way. As soon as he reached for his sword, Jake immediately retreated and said that he was a fool to think that he was even a little different from the other aristocrats. But it turns out he is the worst of them all. The commander-in-chief apologized to him, saying that he sincerely did so, and he asked, what is the point of an apology? Even better this way. For the head of an idiot like him, even if he throws it to those dogs waiting below, his conscience will not torment him. He asked, is he thinking of buying off the traitors with his head and begging for his life? MC confirmed this. As much as he would like to just hand him over and leave, he is sure he has already taken care of stopping them. In that case, as a commander, he is obliged to fulfill his duty to the end. The rebels will be satisfied with the heads of 2 commanders, and in exchange they will spare his people. The commander-in-chief asked, 2 commanders? Was he really going to offer them his head to save his subordinates? MC said that these people he had pulled along with him, he promised to prove to them that even starting from the very bottom, it is possible to realize dreams. They trusted him and went this way to the end. So he should also bear responsibility for this. because he is their commander. Now the commander-in-chief saw him in a new light. He laughed hysterically and said that this is the sign of a true leader. What a pity. If not for this Crawford, if he were his master, then everything could have turned out differently. Immediately after these words, MC pounced on him with a furious grin, and he closed his eyes, thinking about everything, after which he swung his sword and told him not to forgive him. Watching his own body fly separately from him, he thought that he expected this outcome, but did not think the gap between them was so huge. Perhaps this is the end. He told them to flee without looking back if he didn't return by the appointed hour, so he could die with a clear conscience. After all, he had always been prepared for such a death, and yet one thing haunts him. If he had the same chance as he did, what would have happened? He fell into darkness, but this was not the end of his life, and he began to hear a distant voice asking him to wake up. He slowly opened his eyes and saw a young man in front of him and asked who he was. This guy immediately slapped him in the face, tearfully asking him to wake up, and he indignantly exclaimed, "What is he doing?" Confused, he touched his cheek, which was burning from the blow, and thought, what happened? Had he just been slapped? What idiot dared do that? This young man, wiping away his tears, called him Young Master Lucian and asked him to come to his senses. Hearing that name, he was confused. After that, he looked around and realized that something was completely wrong. What happened to his hands? Where did the calluses and scars go? His skin isn't just clear, it's like that of a pampered aristocrat. And this guy, who is he anyway? He just beat a man half to death, and now he's crying. This young man burst into tears even harder and exclaimed that this was such happiness. He already thought that he's dead. His heart almost stopped. Something like this had happened. It would be bad for him, his personal servant, and it would be a terrible tragedy for the entire estate. MC thought, what kind of nonsense was he talking about? Young master? Personal servant? He had never said such words in his life. The main thing is that he clearly remembers that he died. He cut off his head. No one survives something like that. Then how is he still alive? He looked around and thought that if he put it all together, the conclusion was obvious. Right now, he was in the body of some stranger. He walked up to the mirror and smiled, noticing that he had such an incredibly handsome face. It was immediately obvious that this refined appearance belonged to an aristocrat and from an obscenely wealthy family at that. He glanced at his personal servant and thought that the first thing he needed to do was gather information. This guy's name seemed to be Hans. He turned to him and said that he had a question, which immediately made him nervous and said that he could ask him anything. He asked what year it was. He was surprised by this question, but decided that it was the effect of the medicine, and answered him that it was now the 846 according to the imperial calendar. MC was confused. That was 15 years after his death. It turns out that he had returned to the past. He had no idea how or why this happened, but he couldn't panic. Now he needed to focus on the main thing. He tiredly grabbed his head and said that he had one more question. Was he probably tired of living? This made the poor servant flinch in fear and ask what he meant. MC said that the pathetic servant dared to touch his master while he was unconscious, and without permission, at that. Had the rules changed here? If not, then let him tell him who he was. Hans became very nervous. He bowed to him and apologized, saying that he had been so excited that he had completely forgotten himself. He was Lucian Valdek, the third son of the great Valdek family. MC was surprised and wondered, was that the same Valdek? The Valdek family is a renowned family, one of the pillars of the empire, standing by the emperor's side since time immemorial, whose power rivals even that of the imperial family. A truly great house, he is well acquainted with the affairs of this family. After all, 15 years ago he served as a guard at the Valdek estate. It's so strange, he died and woke up at his old job, but in the body of the third son of the Valdek family. He chuckled and thought it was simply ridiculous. All his past life, because of his lowly origins, he endured every conceivable and unimaginable humiliation. And now he was suddenly given a chance? He always wondered how high he could fly if he had the same opportunities as others. And now fate had decided to give him an answer? If so, then he will definitely fly high and show everyone what kind of life he can achieve. Having accepted his new life, Lucian got dressed and went for a walk, simultaneously noticing everything around him. The Valdek estate didn't disappoint. As a mercenary, he'd been everywhere, but he'd never seen such luxury. Besides, he'd have to get used to this place, and quickly. Although, ever since he left, all the servants had been acting strangely, whispering that he was dying. He turned to Hans and asked if it was his imagination, or if the atmosphere was odd. He replied that it was natural. After all, he'd locked himself in his room and allowed no one but himself in for a year and 2 months. He chuckled and wondered what that even meant. What did this aristocrat lack that he barricaded himself in his bedroom? If he blamed it all on the whims of aristocrats, he simply wouldn't have been allowed to behave so capriciously. After all, this house is ruled by a tyrant who has defended the empire for centuries. A man of unbending principles and convictions, Archduke Sigmund. This man certainly wouldn't have silently watched his son rot in the corner. So it was one of two things. Either Lucian was such a hopeless slacker that he was about to be disinherited, or the Archduke had a good reason to turn a blind eye. Until he figured out what was going on, he needed to avoid meeting his father at all costs. The butler ran up to him and said that it meant the reports of his full recovery were true. Seeing the young master after a whole year was a boundless joy for the humble butler. How was he feeling? Was he having trouble walking? Lucian remembered him. This man also served in the Valdec household. He was Edwin's head butler. In his youth, he had come here as a hostage from an enemy family, but his exceptional talents were recognized and he was entrusted with the management of the entire household. He was Archduke Sigmund's right hand. Things were bad. He had stumbled upon the one he least wanted to see. He couldn't help but notice his street manners. The only thing that saved him was that the butler hadn't seen Lucian for a whole year. In that case, he'd have to play the most noble man he knew. He adopted the commander-in-chief's demeanor and told the butler with a smile that he was very grateful for his concern. With his prayers, he was doing much better. He had neglected his duties for so long, locked in his room, that he decided to go out and find out how things were going at the estate. Meeting him was a great success. He hoped their family was prospering. Edwin seemed surprised by his behavior, but he didn't show it and answered him with a smile that House Valdec was more powerful than ever, and he was glad to see that he was also full of strength. He laughed and asked what problems there could be when he was in charge of affairs. He thought that it seemed he didn't suspect anything, in which case he should continue in the same spirit. He said that apparently he had worried in vain. Now he could go in peace. After all, this was his first walk in a long time, and he was a little tired, but Edwin said bluntly that he had to ask him to stay. The atmosphere changed instantly. MC became nervous, and the butler informed him that Archduke Sigmund wished to see him immediately. After that, he went to his father's study, and he looked very stern. Sigmund said that he had a question for him. Why was he still alive? Lucian was confused by this question and asked what he meant. Sigmund said that he was going to turn a blind eye to it. He could tolerate that he had neglected his duties and behaved like a capricious child, hiding behind the death of his mother, but he had crossed all boundaries. It seemed to him that not only had he not left the room in protest for over a year, but he had also neglected his own life and tried to end it. MC had no idea what he was talking about, and, remembering his first moments in this house, wondered if that was why Hans was crying. He nervously told his father there had been a misunderstanding, and he firmly said this was his last chance. Let him spill everything that was on his mind. Wasn't that what he wanted? This was why he had caused all this fuss and even decided to swallow sleeping pills, just so he would listen. MC stared at him in shock, then nervously clenched his teeth and realized why he had no memories of Lucian. The Archduke's third son, 15 years ago, when he served in the Guard, he died around the same time. Archduke Sigmund Valdec, he has 4 sons, all from different mothers. During his 10 years of service to House Valdec, he had crossed paths with young masters and their mothers more than once. However, he had no memory of seeing Lucian or his mother. His mother died early of illness, shortly after he entered the service, and Lucian himself, for some reason, suffered the same fate. At the time, he assumed that he and his mother were simply in poor health and paid no attention to it, but in reality, things were different. His mother's death and the precarious situation in the family became an unbearable burden for a child, so he decided to take a lethal dose of sleeping pills to attract the Archduke's attention. But after being locked up for more than a year, he didn't take into account how weakened his body was. His body couldn't withstand the effects of the medicine, and he simply died. At first, he thought the Archduke was too harsh with his son, whom he hadn't seen for a whole year. But now, knowing everything, he can understand. No matter how great a ruler he was, in his heart he was probably terribly worried, as any father would be for his child. However, now was not the time to worry about other people's feelings. He himself was 1 foot in the grave. He made it clear to him that this was his last chance. This is a real ultimatum. He can practically feel his golden future crumbling at the seams. If he blurts out even one word that the Duke doesn't like, at best, he'll be exiled to some remote monastery to atone for his sins, forever cut off from the outside world. Or, worse, he'll be sent to the wild north, where he'll spend the rest of his days suffering from the bitter cold, fighting off monsters, and begging like a pauper. No way. He's paid too dearly for this life to waste it so senselessly, and he's absolutely not going to let his precious future be ruined because of some family drama he has nothing to do with. He told his father that since he told him to speak his mind, that's what he would do. First of all, for the fact that he has tarnished the honest name of the Valdec family with his insolence, and for causing him so much worry, he offers his sincere apologies. He is solely to blame for what happened, and there are no excuses for him. Whatever punishment he chooses, he will accept it without complaint. His father irritably said that beautiful words cannot bring back the past, but he did not let him finish and asked if perhaps they should simply rejoice. His father was surprised, not understanding what he meant, and he said that what was done could not be undone. He miraculously held on to this life and no longer intends to cling to the past. From now on, he will live for the future. Therefore, he asks him, not as the Archduke, but as his father, to say at least a word of parting words to him. A wayward child sincerely repents before a parent, and a parent proudly accepts him back. Is this not, according to the laws of heaven, the true bond between father and son? Edwin was struck by his words and noticed that the atmosphere had indeed changed. Could this really be young Master Lucian, the same boy who used to flinch at every sound? The Archduke remained silent, MC's heart pounding with excitement the entire time. Sigmund asked if he dared raise his voice and lecture him about his fatherly duties, but he only liked it, saying that you'd see all sorts of things if you lived long enough. Lucian smiled, then let out a barely perceptible sigh of relief, glad that it had worked. He knew it. Instead of beating around the bush, he should have gone straight ahead. The Archduke Valdek, he knew, loathed cowardly mice. He preferred wild dogs that could bare their fangs. Sigmund said that it seemed that being close to death had truly robbed him of his fear. Since he was talking about the future, let him tell him what he intended to do. He closed his eyes, and remembering his fight with the commander-in-chief, replied that he would first take care of his worthless body, and then take up fencing seriously. His father was surprised, not believing it, and he said that first he would have to get his frail health in order, but if he ate well and slept a lot, everything would somehow work out on its own. Sigmund was still surprised. He smiled, and remarked that he had a good tongue. Whether these were empty words or not, time would tell. After that, he called the butler, and ordered him to arrange for him to be given this again. This would do him far more good than a moralizing lecture, which he would ignore anyway. MC didn't understand what they were talking about, and Edwin bowed to the Archduke, saying that he understood everything and would look into it immediately. Lucian kept wondering what they were talking about, but soon he saw it with his own eyes. Several carts with chests containing gold pulled up to his estate. Seeing this, he thought it was all some kind of nonsense. So this is what it means to be noble? So the mysterious thing they were talking about turned out to be simply an obscene sum of money, and it was only for 1 month? With that kind of money, if he had that much gold, he could completely remake this pathetic body and create that very elixir. Meanwhile, Sigmund came to the greenhouse with Edwin. The butler thought that the late Duchess treasured this place most of all. The Archduke hadn't come here for a long time, and he, of course, expected something like this. But for him to come in person, it was all because of how young Master Lucian had changed. Even if he had fallen out of his father's favor, he was still the son of the late Duchess, whom he loved so much. He would never abandon him to his fate. Sigmund said it was a pitiful sight. His eyes were always shifting, as if he were mortally afraid of something. As soon as he raised his voice, he began to whine like a beaten dog. His behavior was too different from her character, so he decided that he only inherited his mother's appearance. But today, for the first time, he caught himself thinking that he could be wrong. He too, hadn't he seen him meet his gaze and speak his mind? Edwin said with a smile that he had held himself surprisingly firmly, with a sense of true calm and dignity in his demeanor. The young master was naturally thoughtful and gentle, which was why he seemed so far behind the other brothers. But be that as it may, the blood of the Archduke flows in his veins. Sigmund smiled and said that they had yet to find out. The trials that awaited this child could not be overcome by mere chatter. Edwin said that he was afraid a problem had arisen. Young Master Lucian's allowance had been resumed, but they had discovered evidence of embezzlement. The investigation indicated that the second master, Jordi Valdek, was involved. Moreover, he had fired the headmaid serving his third son and installed his own man in her place, clearly intending to keep everything under control. Sigmund noted that the boy was capable, but too narrow-minded, and that was his main flaw. He understood his dislike for his third son's relatives on his mother's side, but such an obsession? Edwin asked if he should take special measures. Sigmund told him not to interfere, and he asked if that wasn't too cruel. He was just starting to take his first steps, after all. He replied that if he had kept a proper eye on his surroundings, such a thing would never have touched him. In any case, Lucian was simply paying for his cowardice last year. Everything had worked out perfectly, and he was interested to see how he would handle it. If he couldn't solve even this problem, then there was nothing to be expected from him. While the Valdek blood might be the key, the door must be opened with one's own hands. A few days later, MC locked himself in his room again, and Hans guarded his quarters. 3 days had passed since he had received the funds. The young master said that the conversation with the Duke had gone well, and the funding had been restored. But knowing their relationship, it must have been difficult for him. He must have had to gather all his willpower, and now he was trying to move on despite such a heavy burden on his soul. But Lucian wasn't worried at all. He was only thinking about how he would manage the money. At that time, he was brewing that elixir. He wiped the sweat from his brow, glancing at the notes in the book, and thought that Hans probably had a lot of questions. But since he was guarding the door as he was ordered, he had no shortage of loyalty. The Duke's son suddenly took up alchemical instruments, although he had never handled them before, and he was also looking for an herb that costs an exorbitant amount of money because it grows only in moonlight. Not to mention the fact that its properties are not fully understood. It's called moongrass, and to top it all off, this kid spent every last coin to buy it. He asked Hans to buy up all the moongrass. He may look crazy now, but in just a year, the price will skyrocket tenfold, maybe even 20-fold. Then, moongrass will be worth a fortune. He laughed with joy, then pulled himself together and thought that he should give credit to the alchemist's courage. At that time, the success of that very remedy was in great doubt, and yet they took the risk and bought up all the moongrass in the empire. It was a lifelong bet on which the fate of their guild depended. And thanks to their audacity, nectar, the drink of the gods, was created. For daring to name a simple potion after the gods, they even faced accusations of blasphemy. But as soon as the nectar's properties were revealed, everyone immediately began singing its praises, forgetting their previous threats. He uncorked the bottle and inhaled the aroma of the elixir, smiling contentedly. More than 1,000 years ago, there was an absolute, irrefutable truth. One's level of Viona was determined from birth, and this limit was impossible to surpass. Innate talent was in the hands of fate, and no one could change their nature. No matter how hard one tried, it was impossible to break such limitations. But that was the old belief. What broke this immutable law was precisely nectar. Simply drinking it was enough to transform even a complete mediocrity into a passable swordsman. Of course, the effectiveness of his version was nowhere near the original. In terms of quality, it was more like a cheap knockoff. But to restore such a battered body to its feet, there was no better remedy now. He was lucky. When turmoil later engulfed the empire, the Alchemists' Guild was the first to burn. The nectar recipe, which had upended the balance of power, was deemed too dangerous and therefore destroyed. So, he was able to recreate something similar, gathering every available bit of information. Of course, most died from side effects during the experiment, but he dismissed the thought, deciding to stop stalling, and tried the elixir, thinking that what mattered was what would happen next. The result of converting the power of nature into a person's own strength. Mana. The quality and power that can be extracted differs dramatically depending on how well the circulation proceeds. The process of distributing and returning mana throughout the body. Now, he uses the power of nectar to forcibly expand the blocked channels of this body. But even if the channels opened, what's actually happening? There's no resistance in the body, no pain that inevitably occurs when absorbing mana. On the contrary, mana flows freely, as if returning to its native element. Even the bodies of newborn babies contain impurities that interfere with circulation. Could Lucian really be one of those called geniuses? Evening fell. Hans paced thoughtfully, waiting for the young master, and then the doors finally opened. MC asked if anything had happened while he waited. A servant rushed to him with tears in his eyes, asking if he even knew how much time had passed since he entered. He called him, but he didn't answer. He himself had strictly forbidden entry, so he remained outside. He was so afraid that something had happened to him. He was so worried about him. Seeing his smile and confident eyes, he fell silent. Then, perplexed, said his name and began to examine him from all sides, saying that he knew it was him, but for some reason, he couldn't shake the strange feeling that he was seeing a completely different person. Lucian smiled and mentally called him a scoundrel. He knew the old Lucian better than anyone. It was no wonder he sensed something was wrong. This body needs a lot of food and time to get stronger, so outwardly, he hasn't changed much yet. What's happening inside is much more important, and there, changes are happening at an incredible speed. It's all thanks to Lucian's innate abilities. He's sure of it. This boy's potential puts him on par with the greatest heroes who have changed the world. If he plays everything right, then in a year he will return to his former self as a mercenary. He told Hans that all this was possible thanks to him. He didn't understand what he was talking about, and he, placing his hands on his shoulders, told him to remember. Misdeeds are punished, and merits are rewarded, and to listen carefully. He won't repeat himself. He laughed ominously, and ordered him to sell everything he had and buy as much moongrass as possible. He promised that his life would be easy and pleasant, and together they would rise to the very top. Hans looked at him strangely, and MC thought with a smile that he was jealous. In his time, such aristocrats were hard to find. A week later, the two of them went into the forest. Lucian smiled and thought how blissful this was. Could life really be that simple? A sumptuous dinner is always on schedule. The rooms are spotlessly clean, and he hasn't lifted a finger. They even make up his bed for him, although he used to go hungry all the time. Thanks to this, he was able to fully focus on his recovery and also think about what was bothering him. He took a piece of paper from his pocket, on which he had drawn himself when he was still a mercenary named Jake. He asked the captain about it, and he said that no one even remotely like him had ever hired on to the guard. Some stranger was now taking over his former shift, but perhaps it was even better this way. This meeting would bring him nothing but an extra headache, and he wasn't ready to see his former self yet. He would probably just burn with shame. Hans called out to him and asked uncertainly, was he really going there? He said he would never set foot on the training ground again. He asked in bewilderment, did he say that? Hans exclaimed irritably that he really did say that. He swore that after that fight with the second young master, he would never return there again. MC thought that judging by Hans's reaction, he was starting to get an idea of what had happened there. Fencing was a mandatory skill for the Grand Duke's children, so it was the perfect excuse for the second young master. Under the guise of teaching him fencing, they instilled in young Lucian an animal fear of violence and made sure he didn't even go near the training grounds. He told his servant that he had an idea what was going on, but they had nothing to worry about. All that was in the distant past. Hans was still worried, and then MC confidently told him to just trust him. At this time, a knight named Hendrik was informed that the young master had come here of his own free will, which surprised him. His subordinate said that he was currently inspecting the training grounds with his servant, and he, thoughtfully twirling his mustache, wondered why this puppy had come here. He couldn't possibly forget what had happened that day, although it could work to his advantage. He ordered an immediate report to the second young master, and he would prepare a warm welcome for him when he got here. Meanwhile, Lucian looked around the training grounds in surprise and thought that he had hoped for such a turn of events, but it exceeded all his expectations. Not only was it full of excellent weapons that wouldn't break from a couple of blows, but there was also plenty of room for any maneuver. And all this wealth belonged to just one person. If he could train in such a place, maybe he could save more of his men. This thought made him slightly despondent, but he was quickly distracted by the voice of a knight approaching them. Hendrik said his eyes hadn't deceived him. It really was the third young master. What a surprise, he didn't even believe the news at first. He still remembers how a year ago, during training with Lord Geordie, he ran from here in fear, not even daring to turn around. He was exactly like a lamb running from a wolf. Apparently, that's why he still trembled with fear at the sight of this place, since he dragged a servant into the sacred abode of warriors. They hadn't seen each other for a long time. He remembers how a year ago he personally corrected his stance together with the second young master. If, of course, he hadn't forgotten about it. He remembered how he was shaking with fear, but he only enjoyed it, and said that it was a glorious time. MC chuckled at his words and thought he was so impudent. A knight is the embodiment of honor and loyalty. As a rule, they come from noble families. From a young age, they undergo rigorous combat training and are taught etiquette, and only after accumulating sufficient merit on the battlefield do they receive the title of knight. In the end, they are no different from guard dogs and expensive collars, or so they say. Let the Lord shower them with wealth and honors. They are obliged to respect the bearer of noble blood, but this one dares to behave so insolently. Apparently, Lucian's precarious position played a role, but still, he is just Geordie's dog, and he has only become so dissolute because he feels supported. If he could, he would give him hellish training. He already imagined throwing knives at him, but if he did so, the Archduke would not forgive him. In any case, knights are the main fighting force of their family. Punishment without official procedures will only create unnecessary tension in the relationship between the lord and vassals. It is still early. The time has not come. He told him it was foolish to avoid the training grounds because of past affairs. From now on, he planned to come here often. As he said, a whole year had already passed. Shouldn't they make up for lost time? The knight laughed at his words and said it was too late, and he claimed to want to learn fencing. He asked, too late? He was 16 years old. The man said that since he didn't know, he would explain everything to him. If a person is over 15, then it's all over. Sword form is a secret technique, the legacy of their ancestors, granting enlightenment to those who repeat its movements. It is the essence of ancient wisdom, developing the body, but all this is meaningful only on one condition: if the path to magic is open. And at 16, this path closes, so the technique turns into ordinary exercises. Sword form without enlightenment is just an empty shell, meaningless body movements. He patted him on the shoulder and said with a nasty grin that it even suited him. He had a chance to become the greatest master of failures in the empire. Maybe he could save time and find his true calling? And if that didn't work out, he could always devote his life to tending the garden. After all, everyone has their role. MC remained silent, and Hendrik smiled contentedly, noting in his mind that he couldn't even utter a word. For starters, the statement that the path of magic closes at 16 is a lie. Nonsense that will crumble at the first test. But that doesn't matter. Then he can just play dumb, because the goal would already have been achieved. An idiot, incapable of even objecting, crushed by his own ignorance. A worthless creature laughed at by his own servants, who were afraid to even move. A pathetic character, just like a year ago. Lucian suddenly started acting like the body's previous owner, and said that something in his words didn't match up with what he knew. The path of magic closes at 35, not at 16. So, as far as he knows, nothing prevents him from starting training right now. The knight became slightly nervous, but didn't show it and asked mockingly, "Is he so sure of that?" MC said he was wrong. Did his brother Geordie think so too? He answered that it went without saying. It was a well-known fact. He contentedly smoothed his hair and thought that this was the end. As soon as his name was mentioned, he wouldn't even dare argue. Lucian said that everything was correct. His brother said the same thing. He suddenly grabbed Hans by the head and said that it looked like a curse was hanging over the Waldeck house. He thought so too, right? He felt slightly unnerved by his actions, and then he grabbed his head and shouted at the knight. Why was he dragging him into this? They were questioning a self-evident truth known even to a common mutt, and they were still confused about it. At their age, how many talents had this erroneous fact deprived them of a chance? He was about to burst into tears of grief. Just think, his own brother is brainless. Hendrik was confused, not understanding what he was talking about, and MC hit himself on the chest, telling him not to stop him. If his words were true, Then it was a disgrace to their family and a real disaster. He asked with a smirk. He wouldn't deceive his lord's son, right? The knight became nervous and asked what he meant. He meant to say he was trying to deceive him? Lucian asked him to forget what he had just said. He had simply blurted out something stupid because he couldn't believe his ears. A knight of House Valdek would never stoop so low, right? He nervously answered that, of course it was, and he approached him, saying that he thought so. So they couldn't just turn a blind eye to it either. He smirked, thinking that he would tell him what happens when you loosen your tongue too much, and said that he clearly didn't understand how serious this was. If he had simply wanted to humiliate him, he would have let it go in one ear and out the other, and then raised his voice and theatrically spread his arms, saying that not only the knights but everyone here looked at him with disdain. It was his fault for forgetting his duty and wasting time. But can one reproach him for that? But that's not the point now. If he, a knight, and his brother, the support of the ducal house, were depriving them of talented fighters because of false information, then he couldn't turn a blind eye to that. This would undermine the Valdek Knights' military might and jeopardize the safety of their subjects, the foundation of their well-being. And that was a huge risk. The servant was so moved by his words that tears welled up in his eyes, and MC declared that, as a bearer of the Valdek name, he should naturally be furious. He was proud of how eloquently he'd said everything, and asked Hendrik if he now understood the gravity of the situation. He pointed a finger at his chest and threateningly advised him to prepare for the consequences. He would report this to his father and ask him to tighten internal discipline. The knight became very nervous and thought, the boy who used to tremble at the mere mention of his father is acting like this? Why is he exaggerating everything so much? Has this brat always been like this? He used to be as timid as a lamb, and now he's like a wolf. Jordy came to the training ground and asked what all the noise was about. Hendrik turned to him worriedly, hearing his voice, and Lucian smirked, thinking that he had decided to grace them with his presence just in time. Seeing his brother, Jordy grimaced in disgust, and Hendrik ran up to him, saying that he would explain everything to him now. He began to excitedly tell him what was going on, but Hendrik raised his hand, ordering him to stop. There was no need to explain. He came closer to him and quietly and discontentedly said that he had seen this disgrace with his own eyes. He fell for the provocation of a boy who was young enough to be his son, and he is deeply disappointed by this, and let him put on a simpler face, unless, of course, he wants to disgrace him even more. He glanced at his brother, Hans, at this time hid behind Lucian, and nervously asked what they should do. He seemed furious. He noted with a smirk that the expression on his face was just right. The second son of the Valdek family, Jordy, ever since he gave up searching for himself, all he does is take it out on the servants at night. And is he a true aristocrat? He just has an inflated ego and a nasty, hysterical character. And most importantly, he is vindictive. As soon as he considers someone useless, he unleashes all the dogs on the poor fellow and throws him out. In fact, it even plays into his hands. He greeted his brother with a smile and said that, as far as he could see, he was doing well. Jordy noted that he really was a thick-headed boy. Whatever he had told Sir Hendrik, he had seen it all from beginning to end. He dared to tarnish the honor of House Valdek. MC asked in confusion, when did he tarnish their honor? Could he be more specific? Jordy said that Sir Hendrik had retreated long ago, and if there had been a misunderstanding, then hiding behind his name and sowing discord was a clear mistake. He couldn't escape the answer. However, he wasn't going to scold him for it. He knew perfectly well how much blood he had shed for House Valdek, and what the price of his loyalty was, unlike his. He couldn't even stand sword training. He ran away in fear. And does he really think he has the right to blame him for anything? For starters, let him learn to respect the knights, because it is thanks to them that the Valdek line still exists. He turned to him and asked for their forgiveness for the commotion today, caused by his brother. It was only the mistake of a foolish child, so he asked them to show leniency. From now on, he would keep a closer eye on his wayward younger brother. Looking at his nasty grin, Lucian thought with a grim face, so this is how he decided to play the card? He did have a brain after all. In fact, he was the one showering them with insults, but he deftly turned everything around, as if he had insulted the knights, and even portrayed himself as a noble defender. He won this round. He said that this was expected of his older brother. Only a small misunderstanding had arisen between him and Sir Hendrik. In all fairness, he should have scolded him for his insolence, but instead he taught him a valuable lesson. After all, he, a fool, called his brother brainless. Hans became very nervous and asked him to shut up, but he continued, saying that he was ashamed that he had uttered such offensive words. Today, he, his younger brother, was once again illuminated by the light of his generosity. The knights were perplexed by what was happening, and MC excitedly called out to his servant, saying that they must immediately write down his brother's wisdom. Paper is no good. Let him prepare the best silk. So he decided to use it to erase the image of the weakling Lucian and engrave himself in the memory of everyone here. No more former third son, then the insignificance no longer exists. He told Jordy that now he had to leave, and quietly added that there was no point in both of them lingering here. Jordy furiously said that he didn't respect anyone at all. He thinks he can just leave? He asked in response. Did he forget? Their father hasn't taken his eyes off him lately. He had nothing to lose, but he had something. Jordi remained silent, and he, having said that he would take this as consent, took his servant and said goodbye to his brother. After that, he quietly told him to move his feet faster. They needed to get out of here. Meanwhile, Hendrik hesitantly approached Jordi and asked, "Are they really going to let him go so easily?" He remained silent, glaring furiously at Lucien's back. Meanwhile, they left the training grounds, and Hans, nervously glancing back at the building, asked, "Will they get away with this?" He knew Lord Jordi's fierce temper better than anyone. He wouldn't forgive them for this. Even if they got off easy, he was sure that terrible night would finish him off somewhere in an alley, and no one would even know. This made him burst into tears, and MC asked him to calm down, thinking that only someone who had been through it could understand this fear. When an incompetent boss not only ruins everything but also washes his hands of it, he knows full well how lousy that feeling is. He told the boy with a smile that it wouldn't happen, so he shouldn't worry. No knight would dare pull something like that, and he wouldn't sit idly by either. He offered him a hand to help him up and told him that he was in trouble because of him. When a master behaves like an idiot, it's always the subordinate who suffers, and he, his personal servant, must have had it the worst of all. Hans was touched by his words and promised him that in the future he wouldn't allow his people to be humiliated or made to tremble in fear because of his stupidity. Hans took his hand and trusted him. Time passed. Lucien paced furiously down the corridor and thought that since that incident at the training ground, he had guessed everything. Why everything was so quiet. The Jordi he knows isn't the type to sit back and take it, but now he knows everything. He was plotting such a petty, dirty trick behind his back. He clenched the budget report in his fist in rage and exclaimed, "Does he have any idea how long he's been waiting for this day?" Hans also agreed with him. "There's no way they can let him get away with this." MC asked, "Is he ready, right?" He confidently punched the air, confirming this, and he shouted in rage, "How dare they touch his money?" And Hans added that they touched his monthly payment too. It all started with the budget report that Lucien received today. It was the day his account was supposed to be replenished, so he could buy everything he needed. That's how it was supposed to be. But when he saw the report, he was shocked. His pocket money was cut by 75%, and Hans's monthly salary was cut by 30%. Then he realized that this second son had encroached on his money through the headmaid he had assigned to his wing. Embezzlement is a serious crime in noble society, for which one can even be executed. And yet, he managed to pull off something so outrageous because he had given in to a weakness, which he then took advantage of. After the death of the third lady, Lucien's mother, he handed over the management of his budget to another person, the former headmaid named Dana, who had served him faithfully for many years, and not to that lousy girl. He came to her, and she said with a smile that she was seeing him in person for the first time. She was pleased to meet him. Her name was Jenny. She was the new headmaid, appointed to replace Lady Dana. She wanted to introduce herself to him immediately after the appointment. But at that time he was not at all eager to leave his room. So, had he finally ended his long wanderings? Hans was outraged by her insolence, and ordered her to watch her tone when talking to the young master. But MC told him to calm down. She was partly right. They wouldn't quibble over trifles today. There were more important things to do. He told the maid that he would get straight to the point. She was the one who drew up the budget, wasn't she? He showed her the report and she chuckled, then asked, "So that's why he called her?" "That's right. She was the one who drew up the budget." She was told that he delegated authority to the previous headmaid, so she was simply doing the job as instructed. But she had to admit she was a little stunned. He was interrogating her when she was simply doing her job conscientiously. He should have been doing this himself initially. Lucien knew she would use this as an excuse. This was clearly the previous Lucien's mistake. He told her that he understood. Perhaps she really had no choice. However, even putting that aside, there was something he couldn't accept. He checked and found that most of the funds his father had sent him had gone toward raising the servants' wages. Considering how much they had suffered due to his negligence, this could be considered compensation. But would she tell him why Hans's wages had not only not been raised, but even cut? Wasn't that too obvious? She chuckled and said that she hadn't even noticed that it had happened. She must have been mistaken. She was responsible for the entire household, so she couldn't keep track of everything. Everyone here could attest to how overworked she was. She glanced at the servants and asked, "Isn't that so?" They winced, and plastering on smiles confirmed it, and MC realized he had nothing more to do here. He sighed heavily and turned around, telling the servant they were leaving. This body was his, but all his limbs seemed to obey someone else. But before he left, he told the headmaid that he would ask one last question, and that she should answer carefully. Does she know who her real master is? She answered him with a smirk that she should ask young Master Jordi first. Lucien knew that to survive, he would have to get rid of the rot, which was exactly the situation he was in now. So that evening, they went to the tavern. Hans was perplexed and asked, "Didn't he say he was going fishing today to unwind? So why were they here?" The MC glanced at the men fighting in the ring and the people betting on them and asked with a smirk, "Can't he feel it? This is where important people hang out. He approached the bar, and the man said that this was no place for brats like him to hang out. He should listen to his advice and leave while he was still kind. Lucian put a bag of coins on the table and asked what kind of tavern this was where the bartender was so picky with his customers. He removed his hood and asked if he had mixed something up. There were several reasons why he hadn't finished off the headmaid yet. First, she wasn't just the headmaid. She was the daughter of the wet nurse who raised Geordie from the cradle. If he touched her, he would get himself into even more trouble. Second, Lucian's side was in complete disarray, even worse than he thought. And if the situation was that bad, the solution had to be accordingly. And finally, the Grand Duke simply cannot help but know about it. In other words, cleaning up this chaos is most likely another test. Then he will have to show them his worth. As soon as he showed the coins to the bartender, he began to behave more politely towards him and sat him down at the gaming table. He took the cards and thought that he could also make some money here. Time passed, he beat another person, and everyone crowded around their table, watching Lucian with interest. The man was shocked that he lost, and MC asked, "Is that it?" His interest had just awakened. Maybe he should stay and they play another game? He refused, afraid of losing even more money. And Hans, looking at this pile of chips, grabbed his head and asked in shock when he had even learned to play like this. Lucian leisurely threw his feet on the table and called the next player. Is it really possible that no one can beat him? He came here because of rumors, but is that all they can do? He thought that since he made so much money, it was time for him to make his move. The doors swung open with a bang. He glanced at them and thought that he was right on schedule. Straightening his shirt, the man approached him with a smirk and apologized for not acknowledging such an important guest and for greeting him so late. His name is Hugo. He is the manager of this establishment. He snapped his fingers. The employees of this establishment immediately politely kicked out everyone present, and Hugo said that it might cause inconvenience to other guests, but he didn't care. The main thing is that young Master Lucian could rest peacefully. He smirked and noted that he hadn't been out in public for a long time, and he recognized him immediately. Although, perhaps, without such an intuition, one cannot survive in his world. Hugo apologized again for the delay, and he told him not to worry. He just came to unwind. The man glanced at his table and said that it was truly impressive. He hadn't seen a guest hit such a jackpot in a long time. Would he mind if he personally made the bet? He grinned with interest and said that of course he was nowhere near as good as him, but as the manager of this place, he had learned a few tricks over time. How about while away the time? Hans found this all rather dubious and asked Lucian to return home. They had already won enough. He had a very bad feeling about this man. He had seen a lot of scary people in the palace, so he knew that such eyes were a rarity. MC looked at him and thought that it seemed that his years of service had not been in vain, and perhaps he was right. Hugo Black Shark, a name that will eventually shake the criminal underworld. His journey began in the dark alleys of a certain city. He had nothing but brute force, but thanks to violence and intrigue, no one could stand in his way. He rose rapidly to power, bringing gambling, smuggling, and even contract killings under his control. Thus, he became the king of the night, ruling the criminal underworld of the 5 territories. Later, taking advantage of the impending collapse of the empire, he won the title of Baron and became one of the imperial generals. Now he's still just a rookie, but he's right. Hans is right. This guy is dangerous. And today he's come to catch a black shark. He offered him a simple game of cards and remarked that it sounded good. He offers him to play with no betting limits. He doesn't want the young master who honored them with his visit to get bored. Lucian joyfully slapped his fist into his palm, praising his attitude. Finally, he found someone he could talk to normally. Hugo smiled, saying that he would consider it an honor, but in his mind, he called him a typical brat, acting tough just because of his last name. He doesn't even realize that with these words he's tightening the noose around his own neck. He glanced at the dealer dealing the cards and thought that this was even better. Having his customers' pockets picked clean wasn't part of the plan, but youngsters like him get stuck deeper with every loss. He'll squeeze everything out of this naive kid. MC remembered something and wondered where his manners were. The man was slightly surprised and asked if something was wrong. He told him that everything was fine, but before they started, he wanted to ask him something. He doesn't mind, does he? He answered him with a smile that he would answer him everything, and he said that they were seeing each other for the first time, but he already liked him. You can tell a leader by the way his people act. Even though his business isn't entirely legal, running one isn't easy. If he'd crossed the line, their people would have found out long ago and eliminated him. Hugo said he knew his place, so he tried not to anger the higher-ups, and Lucian laughed, telling him to relax. He might be from the Valdec family, but they weren't the type to strangle everyone indiscriminately, so let him answer honestly. When are they planning to launch mass production? He didn't understand what he was talking about, and he told him not to play dumb. He was talking about that thing he makes in Vestra. That illegal hallucinogen. As soon as he said that, the man became nervous, and a tense atmosphere filled the room. The servants were dumbfounded by what they saw, and Hans began shouting. Hugo was dumbfounded and asked, "Young sir, what is he even talking about? Hallucinogens? What are they?" Lucian asked again. He'd heard everything perfectly well, so why bother asking? Wasn't he hired by the Marquis of Logren's family? He chuckled and continued to say that this was done to destabilize Waldeck with substance trafficking. To think the Marquis would stoop to such cheap tricks. Is there a line that shouldn't be crossed? Does he agree with that? Although no, in this case, it's most likely he who's striking. Where else would one find such impudence to upend something like this on the lands of Waldeck? Blockheads, like exceptions. He'll say, eternity is revealed. Waldeck is the worst possible adversary. Initially, this would have only been discovered 2 years later. Then the Duke would receive a report on substances in his lands. He would have closed the establishment, but Hugo would have fled the city by then. Experience from past failures proved useful. Hugo bowed and said it was some kind of misunderstanding. He was just a small merchant, counting the pennies in his shop. How can he sell something like that? His whole body trembled, and he screamed that envious people had probably spread a dirty rumor about him. Give him a chance, and he himself would find the one who spread it. And now Lucien asked again. He's saying it's a false rumor, right? So the rice mill he runs is nothing more than an ordinary one, and the underground passage underneath it is simply a back exit from the palace? He'll ask one last time, what stage is his plan at? Hugo was stunned with horror, and wondered if he really knew about the fake shop and the secret passage. If he knew so much, there was no point in making excuses. Then maybe he should kill him? This noble brat, unguarded, could be finished off with one blow. One of the waiters grabbed his weapon, and Lucien told him to think carefully before moving. Hans shook and cried in fear, and Lucien continued to say that his life was at stake. He should be more careful, considering how he had risen. Hugo wondered what he was thinking. Was attacking the heir of Waldeck the same as begging for death? He frowned, then realized he needed to save his own skin and fell to his knees, begging for mercy. He hadn't come to him in person for nothing, otherwise his head would have flown. Lucien smiled, and Hugo continued to sob and scream that he would tell him to be his dog, and he would be. And if he ordered him to bark, then he would bark. Let him order him to crawl, and he would crawl. But let him spare him, young master. All the servants also fell to their knees and began begging him for mercy. Lucien was sorting through the chips on the table when he suddenly threw one of them down and said that an obedient dog wouldn't hurt him. He really needed extra hands. Hugo was delighted and shouted, "Thank you. Just let him order it and he'll do it." Lucien said, "But if he knows, isn't that boring? He doesn't look like someone who's content being a hunting dog." Lucien grabbed his hands, addressed him by name, and asked if he wanted to become a knight. Hugo was stunned and didn't know what to say. He repeated the question in his head. Does he want to become a knight? He'd once dreamed of it like a madman, but in the end, he had to give in because, over time, reality had put everything in its place. No matter how much he trained and how much he risked his life for his master, in the end, he remained just a useful tool for the nobility. After all, his lowly birth couldn't be changed, no matter what he did. So did he want to become a knight? He began to fall to the floor again and realized he would sell his soul just to become one, and he asked, can he really do it? Lucien swore on the honor of the Waldeck family. If he had enough honor and dignity not to be ashamed of himself, his status would not be a hindrance. Hugo, wouldn't he like to live with a human being instead of a tool? Hugo glanced at him surreptitiously, hopefully. A few days later, a new day dawned, and all the servants lined up for Lucien to tell them important news. He asked permission to introduce him to everyone. A talented fighter they had hired from outside. He should introduce himself. Hugo stepped forward and stated his name, that from today on he would serve the young master. He would be happy to work alongside the others. After an awkward silence, Lucien continued to lie upside down. Then he began clapping and said that since they were done with introductions, they should bring the headmaid here. The servant asked again, "Headmaid, why is he calling her?" Lucien asked again, "Why else? The headmaid should greet them, shouldn't she? The last thing they needed was a scolding like last time, right? They'd have to report to the busy headmaid first." Lucien thought they were behaving exactly as he'd expected. It was impossible to deal kindly with these staff anymore. Of course, that was obvious to anyone. For them, the young master was like a rotten rope, terrifying to grasp. If that was the case, he'd hammer it into their heads. A servant approached and told the young master to be understanding. He knew Lord Geordie was paying special attention to the headmaid, so what kind of authority could they possibly have? The others started shouting that he was right, that he should understand them. Why was he deliberately stirring up trouble? They just wanted to live well and peacefully, like before. At that moment, Hans became angry and shouted at everyone to pull themselves together. Had they completely forgotten their duties? The master of this estate was young Master Lucien, not the second master. Hugo asked Hans to leave it to him and said that his correct speech was too great an honor for the likes of them. He bowed and told the young master that he understood his task. It would be easy to beat loyalty into these freaks who forgot their place, but perhaps it would be a little harsh, and he was asking his permission to do so. Lucien chuckled, admitting that he really was resourceful, and this is the first reason why he hired him. He was also lucky. Hugo's addiction was only in its early stages, and if it had progressed further, he wouldn't have been able to help him. He grabbed him by the shoulder and said, "Of course," he allowed it. That's all he was waiting for. He shouldn't worry, and would give them one hell of a show. Hugo replied that he would do as he was ordered. The servant looked at them in bewilderment, and at that moment, Hugo walked straight up to him. He couldn't understand how someone could be so huge. Up close, he seemed even bigger. And why did he look so creepy? After all, he was just a backstreet thug, right? He whispered to him that he was meddling in something that wasn't his business without knowing the local situation. He'd better choose the right side. Does he have any idea how tough Lord Geordie is? The situation had long since turned in his favor. He's not a fool to risk his life for a pittance, is he? Hugo clenched his fist and declared that those were pathetic, final words. The servant asked again. What did he mean? But before he could finish, Hugo punched him in the face, sending him crashing to the floor. The surrounding servants were stunned by the horror they witnessed as the servant flew straight to the side. And Hans, too, hadn't expected this, leaving him open-mouthed in shock. Lucian felt tough, and Hugo looked at the destroyed servant, his teeth shattered, his face reddened from the blow, and blood coming from his mouth. At that moment, everyone started shouting and pointing at Hugo. What's wrong? Why is he being so violent? Even if the young master had brought him, did he really think he could do anything? Hugo replied that he had every right. After all, he specialized in raising morons. After a while, the same servant sat up a little, and the room was filled with noise again, as two other servants grabbed Jenny by the arms, and she screamed for him to let her go. Did they really think they could get away with this? They told her to shut up and listen, but she still didn't understand the situation. Jenny grew angry and asked, how dare he raise his voice at her? He would pay for what he had done. But before she could finish her sentence, she entered Lucian's room and saw that all the servants were kneeling. She was dumbfounded by the horrified faces of her acquaintances, and the servant said, young Master Lucian, as he ordered, they brought the headmaid. Lucian stood and looked out the window, then turned and smiled, asking, are they here? He had only asked them to bring her, but it seemed everyone had become overly enthusiastic. Jenny started screaming, what does this mean? Did he really think he could get away with this? If he'd hoped to intimidate her, he was sorely mistaken. Master Jordy wouldn't let this go. If he stopped now, she'd make sure it ended there. The protagonist chuckled and asked, who said they were finishing? He grabbed his whip and replied that it was only just beginning. The main thing was that the maid could say whatever she wanted, because she would die right here. He approached her with a terrifying expression. Execution, and from time immemorial, has been the most obvious and only way to deliver a warning. She had a compelling reason, and the goal was crystal clear, and most importantly, it was etched in the memory. In other words, even without replacing all the servants, this would be quite sufficient. He exchanged glances with Jenny, and realized that today, he would convey this message to the Duke, that it was a pity for the weakling, the third son no longer existed. He motioned for one of the servants to come to him, and he grabbed Jenny by the shoulders, then forced her to her knees, and she said, young master, she advises him to think carefully. He said he would kill her, but if even a scratch remained on her, does he think Master Jordy would sit idly by? After all, her mother was Master Jordy's nanny, and she was his daughter, so they were practically like brother and sister. At that moment, Lucian was silent for a long time, when he suddenly asked, is that all she could say at the end? If these were her last words, it would be a shame to waste them repeating the same thing. Calling him his brother until death. Didn't it offend her? If she had any trump cards left, let him play them. She said his name, and then realized she couldn't say anything else. Lucian said the headmaid was mistaken, and he had plenty of reasons to execute her. From insulting a nobleman, to negligence, incitement, embezzlement, and so on. She seemed to have forgotten her place, simply because she was raised by a single nanny. What did she think his precious Jordy would do? At most, he'd hit him a couple of times and then calm down, but if his father intervened, he wouldn't be able to do even that, and maybe he'd even reward him for putting the insolent girl in her place. At that moment, she was afraid and couldn't say anything. Lucian blurted out that Jordy was just one of the heirs, as goes whoever stood before her. He'd given her a chance after all, and she'd brought the situation to this point. At that moment, her hands trembled, and she said in a trembling voice that she'd been wrong, young master. Please let him spare her. He looked at her silently and told her to call it bad luck, and a moment later he struck her with a whip. Her blood was spilled. A new day dawned sometime later, and George ran through the corridors, muttering that this was nonsense, that it was simply impossible. Just a couple of days ago, he tucked his tail between his legs when Jenny humiliated him, and now he's gone berserk and threatening to kill her? And that's not the only odd thing. In case of something like this, he'd sent people to the outbuilding where Lucian lived. The servants would definitely try to stop him, and if the division had come to this, it meant he'd taken control of the services. When he reached the room, they told him, sir, there must be an error in the report. Please calm down. A man standing nearby confirmed that this was true, because knowing his character, he wouldn't touch anyone. Besides, he fears him most of all, Sir Jordy. Jordy knew something was fishy, and at that moment he heard a loud scream. When he burst into the room, he saw a bloody whip on Jenny's bloody body. Hugo held her by both shoulders, while Lucian hit her on the back. Jordy clenched his teeth in anger and asked what he was doing. Lucian turned and asked what brought him here. He should forgive him. He was busy right now, so it seemed he should come back later. Today, he intended to rip this infection out by the roots. He told Hugo to pick her up, and he confirmed that he would do so now. At that moment, Jordy shouted for Oliver and Bert to quickly take Jenny from him. They replied that they understood everything, then rushed to run towards her. But Lucian called Hugo and said that if anyone came closer than 3 steps, he was to slit the servant's throat. He took full responsibility. When the servants heard this, they were dumbfounded. Hugo said that they would never let her out of here alive, so he should rest easy. He pressed the tip of his sword to her neck and made a bloody cut. Jenny begged Lord Jordy to help her, trembling with fear, and Jordy shouted at him to put the dagger away. If he didn't obey right now, he would cut off his head. not only throughout his homeland, but also hang them on the palace walls. Hugo replied that he feared this was impossible, because his master was Lord Lucian. He had no reason to listen to someone who wasn't his master, and no matter what happened later, it was his duty to carry out his master's orders. Jordi clenched his fist, trembling, and turned to Lucian, asking what Jenny had done wrong that he was so cruel to her. He replied that she had insulted the master, disobeyed orders, and even lied. He was only giving her what she deserved. He should learn to separate personal matters from official matters. Jordi became angry after this statement. In the Waldeck house, the first young master, Tristan, and the second young master, Jordi. Now they are waging a war over the inheritance. In other words, until the decisive day arrives for Jordia, it's democratically crucial to strengthen his position no matter what. However, Lucian recently publicly humiliated him, resulting in Jordia suffering enormous losses, including the loss of his loyal knight, Hendrik. If he can't protect Jenny, who is like his right hand, this will inevitably be a turning point, and then mistrust and doubt will begin to spread among his followers. In short, it's a complete checkmate. He said he's won. Let him let her go. At that moment, all the servants turned to him, stunned, and Hans also looked stunned. Jenny began to cry, and Lucian was silent for a long moment, thinking, this isn't even funny. Does he just want to hush it all up with one word? After plundering someone else's precious property, does he think his tongue is covered in gold? Nobles are very strange people, and he asked, what are you talking about, brother? What do you mean? 1. He was merely fulfilling his duties as the third young master, and besides, embezzlement is a crime no one can escape, regardless of status. If they simply hid everything and moved on, what would people think? If his esteemed brother was asking so sincerely, he himself would be willing to turn a blind eye, but he lacked the authority. Jordi was already shaking with anger and told him to stop beating around the bush and let him say what he wanted. Lucian replied that since ancient times, those who encroached on another's property were usually punished accordingly, paying back several times the amount stolen. He asked, brother, what price did he mean? A new day dawned sometime later, and Sigmund stood looking out the window with a thoughtful expression. He recalled that the incident had been resolved and asked the head butler if the report was true. The butler confirmed it personally and reported that Jordi had paid young Master Lucien 10 times the amount as compensation, and young Master Lucian hired a stranger named Hugo to quickly infiltrate adult spies into his outbuilding. As a result, young Master Lucian's outbuilding is now better preserved than any other area. He thought about these words and allowed his son to enter. When Lucian entered, he said he heard him calling him, Father. He placed his hand over his heart and waited for a response. Sigmund turned and looked at him silently. He reflected on how his gaze had changed completely. He had caused a lot of noise lately, but Lucian replied that nothing special had happened. He simply punished the servant who did not recognize her own master. Sigmund explained that, however, she had disgraced her brother as a result. He would not forget this for a long time. Could he cope with these consequences? Lucian replied that there was nothing to cope with here. It was simply a matter of restoring order. If he had avoided obvious responsibilities and fear of backlash, how would he dare bear the name Waldeck? He had simply made a choice that would not dishonor their name. His father bowed and said that if Jordi continued to pick a fight with him, he was free to strike back. However, if the conflict escalated and harmed the family, he would side with Jordi, regardless of who was right or wrong. Lucian was surprised and asked, what does that mean? What was he saying? His father asked again, but why was he so surprised? Although Jordi had been abroad, his contribution to the family over the years had been significant. Unlike him, he had been idle for a whole year. As the head of the family, choosing someone who had contributed to the common good, he was acting logically. Lucian thought about it and realized that if he was right, this sounded like an order to trample his brother and elevate himself. His father replied that he must increase his strength and become valuable to the family. Then he would know the answer to his question. Lucian realized that he intended to increase the tension to spur him on. Moreover, if he stated it so categorically, it must mean the succession structure would soon be determined. That's why he wants him to hurry and seize the opportunity before he misses it. Are all fathers like this? Well, since he's so worried about his son, he'll get to it now. At that moment, he pulled something out of his pocket and, turning to his father, said, by the way, what if he's already prepared a move? He handed him the papers and said that it was a very big move too. These thoughts pleased him, and when his father examined the documents, he clenched them in his fist and asked, is this report really accurate? If he'd embellished it for praise, then let him speak up right now. Lucian replied that it was the absolute truth. Moreover, following the orders of the House of Logran, he captured a trader who was distributing substances. He could see for himself right now. At that moment, a magical force emanating from his father appeared before him, and he declared that this shameless Marcus' son was Bernhard. He dared to encroach on the lands of Waldeck. Lucian felt a suffocating pressure. Here was the true sword of the Empire, and the head of House Waldeck. At what rate could he die? He turned to his father and asked permission to tell him something. He asked again, What is it? Lucian explained that even if they reported this to His Majesty, House Logran would surely flee to escape unscathed. After all, they operated through dummy merchant guilds, and technically their hands were clean. Moreover, even if they had to dig deeper, His Majesty feared civil strife. He would inevitably intervene. Sigmund wondered, when had he even begun to understand politics? Lucian explained that, in other words, despite such a terrible act against House Valdek, everything would end with them simply losing their source of income. Shouldn't they at least take something in return? A silence passed between them, and suddenly Father sat on the throne and asked him to explain what exactly he had planned. He replied that it was a method that would leave them no escape route, and he had already prepared everything. Not long ago, a man from their inner circle had surrendered to him. He had no title, but he had earned the Logran's complete trust and had risen to the rank of steward. Father realized that the man the butler had spoken of was an informant. Had the third son really foreseen this turn of events? Sigmund asked. Did he intend to use the traitor to set a counter-trap? Lucian confirmed that was precisely the case, and they were unlikely to expect backstabbing from a steward who oversaw the supplies himself. He had orchestrated everything to make them believe their plan was going swimmingly. Very soon, a key figure in House Logran would have to personally emerge from the shadows, and that was a bold statement. However, his plan had a huge flaw. Sigmund revealed that he had bet everything on a single variable: a traitor and the slums. Human nature cannot be changed. Let him remember that he cannot walk a step with someone he does not trust. Lucian smiled and said he trusted not the man himself, but his desire. And his father asked, what? Lucian replied that he wanted to become a knight, to glorify his name throughout the empire, and write himself into history. Sigmund replied that he had forgotten his place, and Lucian explained that it was a dream he was obsessed with to the point of madness, and he had decided to believe in it. He had believed in this in a past life, and his father replied that it was sentimental. But what would he do if he messed everything up? Lucian replied that if that happened, he would not run from responsibility. A subordinate's mistake was his master's. He would pay any price, even if it meant putting his own head on the line. His father listened calmly and then told him that as soon as he recovered, he should come to the training grounds. Lucian asked, what did that mean? His father replied that he would teach him the Lionheart sword, as he was now a candidate for the next head of the family. Sometime later, night fell, and a servant approached Sigmund while he was reading a book and expressed his sincere shame. Here, in the heart of the Valdek lands, he allowed such a thing to happen. Sigmund replied, enough. He had ordered him to focus on border issues, and he knew better than anyone that he was barely surviving on this task alone. They would consider it pure luck that the third son discovered this first, as Bernhard had gone to great lengths to remain unnoticed. His goal wasn't money or expanding his influence, but his honor, Lord. Sigmund confirmed that he likely planned to use this later to weave intrigues before His Majesty. How could the Marquis care only about his own skin, knowing full well the state of affairs in the Empire? But more importantly, what kind of man was Hugo, joining his third son? Officially, he was known as a thuggish manager of a mountain house, but in reality, he headed a fence organization admired even by the criminal underworld. He didn't give the impression of being someone willing to serve anyone. He personally sought out that person and made them his subordinate. The young master had grown frighteningly quickly. Sigmund considered this man's rise in the cruel underworld. If he'd been fooled by empty promises and unrealistic dreams, he would have been trampled long ago. He clearly saw potential in Lucian, the potential of a master worth risking his life for. He said this was happening sooner than planned, but the third son had proven himself, and he intended to show him the right path. He would begin training him in the family's secret techniques the following day. The subordinate replied that this was a wise decision. Did he already have a fencing instructor in mind? He replied that he would ask Sir Aeson about it. The servant was surprised by these words, and Sigmund said it was sad to disturb him in his declining years, but undoubtedly this time would not be wasted for him either. After some time, the palace began to discuss whether this was really true. Hans asked what he just said. He wasn't joking, was he? He really became the official heir apparent? Lucian replied, how many times did he have to tell you that before he believed it? He whispered to Hugo that he should do something about this boy. Hugo picked Hans up and asked him to calm down. Considering the young master's talents, wasn't this natural? Besides, considering the path ahead, his right hand shouldn't be shaking so much. Hans asked again, he's the right hand? Hope appeared in his eyes, and he began to weep with joy, asking again, what does the right hand mean? Of course, he had served the master the longest, but he still lacked much, and with such a talented young man at his side, how could he possibly measure up? Hugo replied that he was as modest as ever, as he'd expected from the elder Hans. He replied, well, enough of that already. Lucian, watching them, thought that experienced mercenaries really were different. At that moment, he told Hans that Hugo was right. He decided to tell only the two of them before an official announcement was made at the estate. He considered, looking at Hans, that he was timid and that this gentleness could become a weakness, but he was truly devoted to Lucian and had the courage to stay by his side even in the most difficult circumstances. Therefore, if he didn't seek experience and learn to manage internal affairs, he would become the most reliable support one could dream of. He also didn't want to doubt Hugo's abilities. He only needed to open the way to knighthood for him, and only then would he be able to fully realize his potential and then he would become his faithful knight. His smiting sword. Quality was more important than quantity now. He only needed to train them properly. The protagonist announced that from now on, there would be a ton of work. The path ahead could not be traversed alone, and he could only overcome it with them. Hugo replied that he would not fail him, young lord. Hans also said he could rely on them. After some time, the palace was illuminated by daylight. Lucian stepped to the center of the room and reflected on how, in his past life, he had scoured every corner of the continents in search of one thing: the essence of ancient martial arts said to elevate swordsmanship to a new level. These were sword techniques. Among them, there was a level one step higher, the ultimate sword technique. But after all his suffering, what he had received were not the ultimate techniques he had so longed for, nor even the mid-level techniques available only to knight captains. They were merely a pitiful foundation for apprentices. True techniques were inaccessible to those of noble blood, and for a simple mercenary, even the chance to tap into this knowledge was unheard of. But those inferior in skill mastered high-ranking techniques and overwhelmed him with force. And every time he couldn't protect his comrades because of this, he was consumed by a thirst to master true swordsmanship. And now, for someone like him, an unexpected opportunity had been granted. A technique passed down only to the heir of House Waldeck and his entourage, an ancient art surpassing any higher techniques, a chance to learn the art of the lion's heart. How incredible. He was on edge, even though they hadn't even begun. There was still a long time before class, and he was so nervous he'd been hunched over here since dawn. He'd better calm down before class. In his previous life, he'd had no discipline, learning by stealing techniques and collecting blood and knowledge. He'd never had a proper teacher. This second life was truly something special. He smiled and stared ahead, sitting on the floor. A multitude of birds flew past the window, and when Aizen saw him from afar, he thought how much time had passed, and he hadn't even moved. What had triggered this? He no longer saw the same weakness in him. He recalled a conversation with Sigmund, who'd suggested he become Lucian's mentor. He thought there was no hope, but upon closer inspection, he'd noticed something interesting. It would be a little entertainment for him. Aizen replied that since his lord said so, his talent must truly be extraordinary. Sigmund spoke, rather surprised by his attitude. He would understand what he was talking about when he saw it with his own eyes. When Aizen observed him from the side, he understood what was being said. He was the holy swordsman who would teach him. A holy swordsman is a superhuman awakened by reaching the limit of circulation. The highest title for one who has reached the pinnacle of swordsmanship is rare even in the long history of the Empire. He is a deity among all swordsmen, and this legend is right before him. Holy swordsman Aizen appeared before Lucian and, bowing, said that he had not seen him in a long time. Third Lord since his lordship's birthday. From today on, he will be his mentor. Let him call him Aizen Brightener. When Lucian saw him, he realized that Hans had hinted that morning that he would be trained by a knight who had served the Waldeck family for a generation. But how could he have kept silent that this was the holy swordsman himself? He bowed and said it was a great honor to learn from the holy swordsman, and asked him to take care of him. Aizen waved his hand and said that the title was just a big word. He was just an old man. Besides, he was the heir apparent. It was not fitting for him to bow his head like that. Lucian replied that while he shouldn't disgrace the family's honor, how could he not show due respect? He wanted to cast aside hierarchy, for he was someone deserving of respect. At that moment, Aizen saw hope in his eyes, and said that if he insisted, he should do as he pleased. Lucian thanked him for his understanding, and they decided to begin training. Aizen pointed toward the arena and said, "How about a run around the training grounds?" The protagonist began to exercise and decided to start something, asking, "Right now?" Aizen was surprised and told him to stop. He had no questions at all. Why did he need to run? How long? And what was the point of this exercise anyway? Lucian replied that curiosity was certainly nagging him, but since he'd ordered it, it had to be that way. He probably had a reason, though he didn't explain anything. A student should simply follow the teacher's instructions. Aizen considered the difference in his gaze and reaction from the other young masters. This boy was genuinely reaching for the sword. He seemed to understand what his master had said and declared, "That's excellent. Then they'll begin." As soon as he said this, Lucian broke into a run and ran into the arena. He began running several laps, trying his best. In fact, there was another reason he silently obeyed. He'd guessed the true purpose of this run. He was testing his suitability as a student. In other words, he was assessing his potential. He'd done the same thing when he was a mercenary captain. He'd assign new recruits a seemingly cool task, and their reactions alone could tell a lot about the person. He glanced at Aizen, thinking he'd already settled on the right attitude and only needed to demonstrate one thing: endurance. He'd run until he collapsed, and he'd done so an hour later. Suddenly, he looked at his hands and asked, "What's going on? This shouldn't be happening." He'd been running like crazy for so long without feeling the slightest bit tired. On the contrary, the longer he ran, the lighter his body became. He'd only sung a cheap elixir to recover, and his only training had been walking. How was this possible? He continued running tirelessly, and Aizen, dumbfounded, realized he'd only forced him to run to assess his overall condition, and hadn't held out much hope for his physical fitness, but that defied all logic. He wasn't sweating, and his breathing was as smooth as a calm lake. Even an experienced knight who'd ordered mana for years would have struggled to achieve this. Could this really be what he thought? While he was pondering this, he told him to stop, as he'd had enough running around for today. Lucian asked again, what happened? He saw Aizen using mana. The old man said, Third Master, let him answer one question. This morning, how does he calm his mind and body? Wasn't that circulation a difficult meditation? Lucian replied that if he was referring to that incident in the training hall, he was right. He was using circulation, and there was no better way to clear the mind. Aizen realized he was mistaken and asked permission to examine him. He told him not to move, even if the sensations were strange. He began to touch his hand and used his magical powers to look at his palm, and suddenly froze. He suspected it, but he, like himself, had already reached the limit of circulation. However, for him, this wasn't the limit at all. It went beyond what he had achieved. This guy was opening a completely new path. After a while, he lowered his hand and asked, how long has this been happening? When exactly did he complete the formation of the mana circles? He asked again, what was he talking about? Aizen said he'd just checked his body's condition. It was like snow on a plane, and his internal channels were shaped to maximize mana efficiency. Like a water wheel, this was a level only a handful of masters, those who had dedicated their entire lives to training, could achieve. Lucian had certainly expected something like this, but this state was truly near perfection, so there was no need to hide any longer. He, too, had many questions about his body, and if he wasn't at the level of a swordsman saint, then no one else could answer. He said that to answer his question, it had been about a month since he began circulating, and all his mana channels had been open from the start. He heard that circulation was usually accompanied by pain due to the strain, but he hadn't experienced anything like that. Aizen realized he'd far exceeded his expectations. Even he'd achieved this only after decades of hard work. Perhaps the ancients who, according to legend, split mountains and seas, were a fiction about reality. The third son, he wanted to talk to him, even at the risk of disrespect. Would he agree to give up his position as mediator? The protagonist was surprised by this question and shouted, what is he saying? Why should he give up the right to inherit the House of Valdek? Was there something wrong with his body? Would he be unable to learn swordsmanship, or would something terrible happen if he used mana? He replied that it was quite the opposite. His body was truly perfect. Not only could he utilize his mana and body to their full potential, he had the potential to reach even further. In other words, if he focused on the sword, becoming the next source would be a simple matter. Lucian realized he was moving closer to becoming a swordsman saint. He knew Lucian's body was unusual, but this exceeded all his expectations. Thanks to luck, he was able to learn the ancient Lionheart style, and he thought he had found the path to the summit he had strived for in his past life. But he didn't expect to be able to peer even further into the realm of epic swordsmanship. However, it seems he won't be able to. And he said that Aizen mentioned choosing one of the two because he couldn't simultaneously be the heir and follow the path of the holy swordsman. Aizen confirmed that this was true, or more accurately, he had very little time left. Thanks to the power of circulation, he can move like this even at almost 100 years old, but he can no longer deny that his body is aging. If he wants to pass on all his knowledge while he's still a font, his schedule will be tight, even if he focuses exclusively on the sword. If memory serves, the holy swordsman will die in 8 years. Time truly is short. He accepted the offer and dedicated himself to the blade, but the coming turbulent times of this world are not enough. Those who survived the chaos possessed legitimacy, a moment he had long awaited, but he asked for forgiveness and said he wanted to remain a member of the Valdek family until the very end. He made an offer he was unworthy of, and he regretted that he could not accept it. Aizen replied that he should be ashamed of himself for embarrassing his third son. What had he done in his youth that made him so greedy in his old age? It seemed he wanted to leave a piece of himself in this world through his third son. Lucian watched him go and suddenly asked, what if there was another such talented person besides him? Sometime later, a young master arrived at the farm on horseback. His servant ran up to him and announced that the news about the third son had been confirmed. Joshua abruptly stopped his horse and asked, what? So those ridiculous rumors were true? This idiot had been recognized as the new heir. Joshua was surprised, but he dismounted and repeated for the umpteenth time that, just as the rumors had said, the Archduke had included his third son in the line of succession. He was now under the guardianship of the monthly, and he confirmed that he was teaching swordsmanship. Joshua was angry, because he really was a real thorn in his side. It was hard enough for him to find support while being harassed by his two older brothers, and now the neutral factions had another option. He dropped the cloth on the floor and started screaming. Was it really that hard for him to just sit in the corner of his room? The servant tried to calm him down and watch his words, but he started screaming. Watching his words? How could he be calm in such a situation? What if the talents he painstakingly amassed began to waver? His blood was already boiling at the thought of having to call Lucian, who was only a few months older than him, brother. He couldn't just sit idly by. There had to be a way. He turned to the butler and said that since Lucian had begun learning the sword, He'd likely soon need a partner. Tell him to prepare 2 sharp blades. The butler was stunned when he heard this, and Joshua continued to insist that these wouldn't be wooden training swords, but real combat blades. He simply needed to teach him a lesson and show him that nothing had changed. At that moment, Lucian asked, what if there was another candidate? The search might take time, but the one who would repay these lost years, the one who could glorify the holy boy's name for hundreds of years to come. He was talking about exactly this kind of talent. Aizen grinned and replied that he felt heavy-hearted for unwittingly wasting this time on the 3rd young master. It was enough that he even thought about the old man. Please, let him not worry about it anymore. He was grateful for his words already. Lucian thought it must have sounded like nonsense, since even a renowned swordsman couldn't attract his attention. It was only natural that the words of a novice, picking up a sword for the first time, would seem ridiculous. However, he would see, if this body was a blessed vessel, recognized by the saint of swordsmen, then there must be someone blessed with a talent for the sword. In the past, despite his frail frame and knowledge of only primitive fencing techniques, he was the embodiment of a blade and metal, capable of wielding anything on the field with sheer talent alone. The sword demon, Felix, was his strongest vassal, and it was he who would become the disciple who would inherit everything and his mastery, sir. At that moment, they decided to test Aizen's current abilities before moving on to training. He should strike a dummy with vertical and horizontal diagonal strikes, in that exact order, and since he has mastered circulation, he should be able to manage mana, so let him finally demonstrate strikes with the mana sword. Lucian realized this was the first time he'd held a sword in Lucian's body, and he'd have to adjust a bit to his body's level, since they said Lucian had once learned effective fencing. At that moment, he tensed up and decided to use vertical fencing, followed by horizontal and diagonal strikes, and finally, the mana sword. At that moment, his eyes glowed with magical light, and he pounced on the special object and destroyed it. A lot of dust appeared in the arena after the strikes, and Lucian realized his movements were blurry. After all, this was his first time in this body, but perhaps it would be okay for a beginner? I wonder if he'll want to see more? Aizen looked at him silently, then said, I expected something similar. The 3rd young master said, but he surprised him again. In a word, it's terrible. Lucian asked again, what did he mean? Aizen replied, it's the same as what he said. He didn't know why, but he didn't have a ton of bad habits. He ignored the basics, swinging his sword like a desperate attempt to survive. Like a mercenary, he was fixated on strength and speed, which disrupted the balance between his body and mana, and this strike made his movements lose their edge, creating a slicing effect. And when he delivered the final blow, how long did it take to charge the sword with mana? He replied that it took a little over a second or two. Aizen replied that it was just that little bit he spoke of so easily, and at that moment, he raised a sharp blade to Lucian's throat and said it would be enough to take his head off. He must begin by recognizing the value of this time, because the enemy would never miss such a moment. Lucian realized he hadn't noticed the sword touch his neck. What a fool he was, dying without even realizing his head had been cut off, and yet he dared to think so smugly of himself. Aizen smirked and replied, 3rd young master, even a gifted body isn't always strong, and you can't defeat a skilled mana master with brute force alone. And if the body can't withstand the flow of mana, it's wasted, leading to death, unleashing the sword's true power. The inner and outer must merge into a single flow, even though they seem different. A true man is born in this harmony. He abruptly executed a single movement and suddenly struck the dummy, after which he said, this is the path he must take, 3rd young master. And a few days later, the protagonist continued to fight alongside Aizen. The old man insisted that the flow of mana must not be interrupted. Just as physical training refines movement, so too must mana control be achieved. Strengthening the body with mana always leaves room for free circulation and the ability to use it in the right place and at the right time. Lucian continued to struggle, but nothing worked, and Aizen said that when these factors merge into a single balance, only then will he understand the true power of the sword. After these words, Lucian flew far to the side and landed on his foot, angry, and Aizen silently watched the unfolding events. He then said that now he must apply what he had learned and try to defend himself. However, this time, the task was a little more complicated. He must consider the opponent's movement speed and put just the right amount of force into his response. He immediately swung his sword, and Lucian realized that the essence of his teaching was natural, like the flow of water. It allows one to overcome the gap in strength and inflict maximum damage with minimal effort. He must not hesitate and look straight ahead. He grew angry and, gritting his teeth in anger, swung his sword and attempted to strike. Their swords clashed, and their mana was different colors. Aizen's mana was green, unlike Lucian's blue. He suddenly decided to end his training for the day, and wished to remember the feeling he had experienced today. This alone would be enough to become a first-class swordsman. Lucian rejoiced at the end of the lesson and fell to the ground from exhaustion. Then he looked up and thanked his teacher for the lesson. After these training sessions, the arena had to be cleared by the staff. They had already returned to the training he had undergone. Will the young master really be all right? At that moment, the protagonist felt terrible and said that he had somehow survived today's training. His hands were shaking, and he couldn't even believe that these cruel methods were ultimately needed only to eradicate the habits of his past life. He has nothing to do, since there's no other way to fix them, but he quickly grasps the essence, and the more he observes, the greater his admiration. He creates dangerous situations precisely suited to his level, and then, with precise instructions, achieves the correct reaction. Easier said than done. It's impossible to reverse something like this without thoroughly understanding the state of his body. He simply trusted his guidance, but he can already feel it growing in his skin. Previously, he believed that the path to the top lay only through secret fencing techniques. He never seriously considered the balance of his wrist forces and currents, like he does now. Although the most important thing has always been within him. If he had known all this in his past life, how much closer his sword would have gotten to the man who told him to die for him. Then he grinned and rushed at him with an attack. They clashed less often, and he wondered if he could have withstood even a few blows. He somehow felt a pity to end this today. If only he could find the perfect partner. At that moment, several people passed by, and he wondered if it was that guy, and as he approached him, he was growing. How was his health? It was Joshua, who approached Aizen and announced that this was his student. Aizen replied, "Welcome, fourth young master. To what does he owe this unexpected visit? He is currently busy training the third young master, and if he has business, he asks to come back later." Joshua replied that there was no need, master, and the teacher assumed that was the reason for his visit. But before he could finish this sentence, Joshua replied that he was right. Since his brother had emerged from seclusion and decided to train, he, as his younger but more experienced brother, wanted to help. What would he say about this, Brother Lucien? He offered his hand and offered his assistance. Lucien realized that his ideal partner had come to him of his own accord and was delighted. Aizen asked what all this was about. He wanted to help with the third young master's training. He responded by asking if there wasn't a method of training through sparring to test his mana control in practice. He wanted to be his opponent, and as he knows, he doesn't have enough time to communicate with his brothers. If he misses such moments, another opportunity might not present itself. So he risked seeming rude and approached him. MC smirked at this point and thought that the offspring of this family were very good at getting their way. Help with training and communication? It wasn't enough for him to simply barge in uninvited. He'd also brought a real sword to his brother, who hadn't even had a week of fencing training. His intentions are so transparent that they seem almost naive. He obviously wants to crush him and strengthen his position. Since everything is being done through his older brother's help, there won't be any problems. And the presence of a holy swordsman adds weight to the sparring. Even such a young man is trying to corner him, and he's asking him to back down on the succession issue, but if he lets it go, he'll find himself in a difficult position. He approached his mentor and asked him to accept his younger brother's offer. Wasn't the younger brother's impulse commendable? Of course, he simply couldn't ignore such rudeness and confidence that feigned stubbornness would work. He would personally oversee the education of his immature younger brother. Joshua smiled irritably, and MC said that today was the last day his childish behavior would be indulged. Enough of embarrassing the swordsman. Aizen, meanwhile, thought he'd probably figured out the fourth young master's intentions, but he still decided to push through. It seemed bloodshed was inevitable. He nodded and said that since they both wished it, he gave permission. However, this would be the last such sparring match, and he would immediately intervene if he deemed the situation dangerous. They both replied that they would take this into account, and Lucien, patting his younger brother on the head, challenged him to a great fight, to which he irritably agreed. After that, they entered the arena. Aizen warned that this was not a fight with the intention of harming each other, but merely sparring to test their learning. Since this was the third young master's first fight, he should adopt the stance of an apprentice, and the fourth young master should exercise the responsibility of a senior in swordsmanship. Let them conduct this duel in a way that does not dishonor the name of the Valdec family. If they are ready, then let them draw their swords as a sign of the beginning. They both drew their swords, and Joshua glanced at Lucien with irritation, wondering since when did he act like the older brother and constantly repeat junior. He was simply born a little earlier, and yet he behaved so annoyingly. But he would see if he could also talk trash by the end of the fight. In their hierarchy, blood seniority doesn't matter, and he'll soon understand who's really in charge here. MC thought he had such a furious face, he wouldn't even look at his mortal enemy like that. He picked up the sword with his other hand and felt a pleasant weight. 2 months had already passed. In the old days, he would have resorted to any dirty tricks to win, but today he was sparring as the third young master. If he accidentally used techniques from his past life, his mentor would definitely notice. Even if his opponent was cunning and insightful, he was still just a child who didn't know life. He was his younger brother now, so he would act within reason. Joshua asked with a smirk. Was he cautiously looking around? Where had his former confidence gone? Had he finally realized that he was holding a real sword in his hands? Let him not be so worried. They say that tragedies often happen in fights with real swords, but this only threatens opponents of equal strength. However, if he is afraid, he can take a wooden sword. Lucien smirked, deciding to take back his words about the limits of reason. For a disobedient brother, beating him is the best medicine. He said that would be for the best, of course, if he does not want to get hurt. He called him Junior again, angering him even more, which immediately made him attack and say that he will make him regret those words. MC prepared himself and thought that, as expected, teaching him while holding back his strength would not be easy. Joshua also took lessons from the swordsman Saint. His foundation and movements are not at a level to be taken lightly. Besides, he spent almost all his mana in the last sparring with the mentor. However, his lack of experience cannot be hidden. He is so easily led by cheap provocation. He decided to use the swordsman Saint's instruction, focusing his strength and mana control, which filled his leg with power, and he used it to push off and rush towards his opponent, determined to seize the initiative in a split second. He raised his sword over his head, and the swordsman Saint and everyone else froze, watching with concern, while Lucien told his brother to grit his teeth and block the blow, otherwise he would bite his tongue. After that, he struck, and a roar was heard, dust rising throughout the arena. Joshua was able to block his blow, albeit with difficulty, and MC told him to remember that a real man should never give in to weakness. Realizing that he had fallen to his knee while blocking his blow, Joshua became angry and threw his sword away, telling him to just shut up. After that, he increased the distance between them and said that he had only struck him once, and that was with luck. Next time, this will not happen. He ran towards him and swung his sword, which Lucien dodged by taking a step back. Joshua then ran up to him again and struck him down. Lucien blocked it and met his amused, childish gaze before knocking his sword away, and they began to strike each other. Watching this, the butler turned to the holy swordsman and said that the duel seemed to be getting too fierce. Wouldn't it be better to stop it? Young Master Joshua has taken a particular dislike to Master Lucien and is always trying to pick on him. They are almost the same age, and they are constantly compared, so his dislike has only deepened. So when it comes to young Master Lucien, he flatly refuses to listen to anyone. If this continues, disaster might happen. He told him that what he is worried about will not happen. He has a hot temper, but he is not so stupid as to forget his position. Right now, he is simply acting immaturely. He should rather worry about the opposite situation. He was surprised and asked, what did he mean? Eisen chose not to answer this question, and, watching the fight, thought that given the huge difference in their skill levels, such a thought should not make logical sense. The third young master was born with outstanding potential, but he lacked the experience and time to realize it. On the other hand, the fourth young master's talent is unremarkable, but thanks to persistent training, he has already achieved a lot. In other words, even without using fencing techniques in this duel, the gap between them cannot be made up by luck alone. But the fourth young master, unable to restrain his temper, is ruining his own advantage with his own hands. And the third young master calmly waits for an opening. To maintain such calm in front of a real sword, one must overcome fear. And since the third young master demonstrates this, it means that either he knows no fear due to inexperience, or he has the composure of one who has repeatedly looked death in the face. And for some reason, it seems to him that the second is true. They all continued to parry each other's blows, and Joshua exclaimed, where had all his enthusiasm gone? He should have listened when he gave in to him at first. It was not too late to ask him to put the sword down. MC blocked his next blow and thought that this guy was going crazy. But that's not surprising. After all, he thinks he's trampling his older brother into the dirt. His whole body shakes from each of his blows. Initially, he planned to finish everything with one blow, because there is no enemy weaker than the one who falls for provocation. He miscalculated only one thing. Joshua turned out to be stronger than he thought, and his mana was not enough to defeat him with one blow. Now, he doesn't even have enough mana to strengthen his entire body. If that's the case, then he needs to do everything possible to end this in one go. He parried another blow. Joshua noted that his sword suddenly became heavier. Does he really still have the strength for this? Looking at how heavily he was breathing, he immediately dismissed the thought. Judging by his condition, he couldn't have that much strength left. This is just his last-ditch effort. This made him smirk and pounce on him, confident that he would end this duel right then and there, but a counterattack awaited him. In fact, this was exactly what Lucien was looking for. The sword crashed to the floor, but not at Lucien, and Joshua wondered in surprise, had he dodged his blow with full force? If it were that simple, he would have understood. Moreover, if he wasn't imagining it, he was clearly smiling. Could all this really have been part of his plan? Lucien's voice rang out, and he flinched. He asked. He put all his strength into his last blow, not thinking about the next one, right? He didn't realize that his fatigue was just a decoy. That's why he's only the younger brother and he's the older brother. Joshua looked up at him in rage, then pounced on him and told him to win first and then lecture him. But MC stopped his sword with his foot and pinned him to the floor, saying that he was going to do it without him saying anything. He smirked and asked what he thought would happen to him now. Joshua became very nervous and looked at him innocently, calling him his brother. But he swung his sword and asked, so now he's his brother? After that, he taught him a good lesson. News of the duel between the two quickly spread within the family. The servants did nothing but chatter about Lucien's victory and laughed at Joshua. After all, he went there full of confidence and came back as if from his own funeral. Someone even heard him crying. Of course, the reason this rumor spread so quickly and was even slightly embellished was because Hugo and Hans were spreading it. As soon as the servants saw them, they asked them to tell them the details of that day. They were all curious to know if the young Master Lucian had really been recognized by the Holy Swordsman. Only a few would guess that it was all one person's plan. MC was in a great mood, because today was the perfect weather for spreading rumors. His little brother was lucky that it all ended this way. The moment he called him brother and he decided to teach him a lesson, Joshua screamed in fear that he was wrong, and then Lucian struck not at him, but at his sword, breaking it in half. He said that if he pulled a trick like that again, it wouldn't be fun anymore. He should learn to understand where to go and where not, and behave decently. If he understood, then let him nod, and Joshua shook his head nervously. Returning from his memories, MC thought that now those annoying brothers would sit quietly for a while. He glanced at the letter on his desk, and thought that since internal affairs were more or less settled, it was time for him to take care of House Logran. He went to his father in the greenhouse, showed him the letter, and he asked if this was the secret message he received from Hugo. He confirmed it. In a week, they were planning to meet with a representative of the Logran side in Vestra. Sigmund tapped his fingers on the table in confusion and remarked that this was so absurd. Even though this land had lost its significance, it was 2 steps away from their Kelheim. Lucian agreed with him. They must have done this thinking his gaze would not reach it. Sigmund noted that this was a blind spot. And what were his intentions, since he was reporting this? He thought he had entrusted this entire matter to him. He answered that he needed strength. Just because an animal is caught in a trap doesn't mean he has the tools to finish it off. His father asked, so he came to him because he has the tools. It could be called a rational decision, but despite his words about wanting to curry favor, it sounds like he just wants to ride on his back. Does he really believe that if they do this, the credit will be his and everyone will recognize it? A hunter only earns a name when he brings down the prey himself. If he can't do it himself, that's only half the success. He was given not only the opportunity but also the authority to decide everything himself. He chose safety over a challenge. Is this the best choice he can make? He clenched his fist and firmly commanded him to answer, and he said that if this is how he can complete the hunt, he will gladly choose this path. His father frowned, and he continued, saying that if the path he spoke of is the royal road, he believes only those with strength may walk it, while men tremble in the shadow of the beast, claiming that the only form of bravery is to personally strike with a spear is ultimately nothing more than recklessness. Even if successful, it is only mindless stupidity. In the end, he will lose trust. He believes that the essence of hunting is not killing, but defense. If a threat can be reliably eliminated, does it really matter how it is ultimately judged? But that doesn't mean he's going to laugh it off, playing the saint. It's about the person to whom he passes the credit. If the day comes when he can't even draw a bowstring, the fate of whoever inherits this bow will be sealed. His father thought for a moment, then stopped pressuring him and said that that answer was enough. Hearing such an objection straight to his face, he can't remember the last time it happened. He didn't expect to receive such words from him. It was a good answer. He was glad to receive praise from his father, and he continued, saying that a man must be confident in the path he follows. If one word can sway him, he will achieve nothing. He asked if this was really a test. Sigmund confirmed it. He wanted to know if he would waver in the face of authority. If a man is torn, unable to find an answer on his own, who will truly follow someone who can't even remain true to his own convictions? What kind of head of a family is he? He's not even worthy of being called a man. MC thought it was no surprise. He couldn't help but know that this matter was beyond his capabilities. He kept wondering why he was so strict. Truly, nothing comes easy. Since the conversation seemed to have gone well, he decided to return to what he had come with and asked what about support in this matter. He answered that he would give him the necessary tools. Given the situation, if a large detachment were to advance, they would notice. They would probably operate as a small elite group so as not to attract attention. Lucian agreed with him and with an awkward laugh asked if he could spare him a few skilled knights. Sigmund didn't let him finish and said he'd give him black lions. Let him try to bear the weight of the ones sitting in this place. A week passed. Lucian and Hugo went to that place. MC looked around and noticed that this city was in terrible condition. It was much worse than he'd heard. There were almost no people left here. Hugo said that although the city was close to Kelheim, there weren't enough resources here, and it had long ceased to be a transit point, so only vagabonds hung around here. That's why they chose this place. But would he tell him how he knew so much about his plans? Hans also seemed to have no idea. He smirked and promised to tell him about it, but later, for now, they needed to focus on their prey. Did he set everything for the trap? He confirmed it and said that inside the factory, everything exactly matched the fake report. Did they prepare the item he spoke of? They just had to wait for reinforcements to capture him. Noticing how his head was hung dejectedly, Lucian asked if it bothered him that his father had helped them. He answered excitedly that of course it wasn't so. It was a very serious matter. He understood perfectly well that they had no right to make a mistake. He simply regretted his own helplessness. If he had the strength to figure everything out, it would be entirely his merit. MC put a hand on his shoulder and said that he understood his feelings, But they were only at the beginning of the journey. They shouldn't let impatience derail them. Besides, he was only 30. His whole life was ahead of him. Hugo said that he was 23. He was still far from 30, and the age difference between them wasn't that great. MC was shocked by this news. An awkward silence fell between them, and he, clearing his throat, said that he had just turned 20. Hugo smiled sadly and asked him not to correct himself. It would only make things worse. Crows circled in the sky. Lucian looked around and thought that, whatever the case, the appointed time was near. But why were they nowhere to be seen? Suddenly, a voice sounded behind them, striking fear into them. Hugo immediately turned around and drew his sword, about to strike, but the man stopped him and said he was too slow. He couldn't even be called a fighter. Hugo was surprised. He blocked the man's sword with one hand, and he couldn't move. No one had ever surpassed him in strength, and now he felt so helpless. MC told him it was okay. He wasn't an enemy, but he clearly wanted to kill them. With a gloomy expression, he called out to the Black Lion and asked what he was trying to achieve. Hugo immediately jumped away from him and went to his master and asked if the same Black Lion from the rumors was really their reinforcements. The Black Lion is a squad that does all the Valdec family's dirty work in the shadows and answers only to the head of the family. He answered that it was true. They were hunters sent by them to support him. The Black Lion commander, Raymond, greeted him and said that they only wanted to test his assistant's reaction. They had no malicious intent. Lucian reflected that in his past life, he hadn't even been sure of their existence. The terrible rumors about them turned out to be true. He was on guard, but he didn't sense their presence at all. And even now, standing right in front of him, they conceal their aura so perfectly that he can't read anything. Each of them is a true monster. He remembered his father with a smile and thought that the support was truly very powerful. After that, they moved to the inn to talk. MC told the squad that he believed they were already aware of the details of the mission. The Logran family took the bait and were heading here. All they needed was one thing: to take the leader alive. The rest can be killed. They have crossed the line, so there is no need to stand on ceremony. Otherwise, let them act at their own discretion. Raymond reflected that at first he thought the Archduke had sent them simply to do a favor for the third young master, but it seemed that was not the only reason. He maintained his composure even under the sudden attack and showed prudence, assessing their strength and preparing for the worst. Perhaps something will happen soon. He pressed his fist to his chest, saying that he understood everything, and the members of the squad repeated after him. At sunset, the Logran family's carriage arrived in the city. The young master of the Logran house grimaced in disgust and said that it had been such a dreary ride. If not for his father's orders, he would never have gone into such a remote place. The maid gave him a handkerchief, and he got out of the carriage, pressed it to his nose, and thought that he would quickly finish everything and return to the estate. He even found it disgusting to breathe here. He is the fourth son of the House of Logran, Philip Logran. A townsman immediately ran out to greet him excitedly, saying that he had shown disrespect by not knowing about the arrival of such a noble lord. His knight pointed his sword at him and ordered him to stop, saying that if he took even a step, he would kill him. The young man was frightened, and the knight ordered him to identify himself without moving. He bowed his head, asking for forgiveness. He was only there to escort them on orders from Boss Hugo. He was just a pathetic peasant, unworthy of their attention. It was Lucian, and he was glad that everything was going according to plan. Philip ordered the knight to put away his sword. Speaking to such a commoner was beneath his dignity. They went inside the building, and MC thanked the Lord for his mercy, thinking that it looked like the prey would be bigger than he expected. His manners and tones screamed of innate arrogance, and the smugness with which he entered enemy territory without a trace of fear. It must be one of the Marquise's sons. There aren't many guards, about a dozen, as he thought. Most likely, they are Logran's students, and that man who never leaves the boy's side, he needs to be kept an eye on. If there's anything else strange here, it's that he brought the maids with him. Philip called him an idiot and asked irritably why he was standing there. Let him lead them. Lucian ran up to him and said that it was the first time he'd seen such noblemen so close, and that's why he was so nervous from being unaccustomed. He called him a pathetic idiot, and he glanced at one of the maids and wondered why she seemed familiar. A thought occurred to him, which he immediately dismissed. This simply couldn't be true. It was out of the question. She just looked like him. MC led him into the inn. Philip looked around and said with disgust that it was even worse inside, with that terrible stench. That idiot Hugo, did he really embezzle the family's money? Hugo emerged from the shadows and said that everything on the outside was just a distraction. After all, it's what's inside that counts, right? Philip asked, who the hell is he? He replied that he was the steward, Hugo. Since the item requires special care, the preparations had dragged on a bit. Philip remarked that since he'd come out to meet him personally, it meant he wasn't up to any tricks, to which he laughingly asked if he'd really risk angering House Logran for a few coins, even though he'd been sending them those tedious reports, and since he'd actually come here, they must have been very curious to see the item that would cause Kelheim to rot and crumble to dust. He'll let him see for himself right now. Lucian smiled contentedly and thought that he had such self-control. He lied so calmly, and his voice didn't even waver. Philip called him an insolent dog and said that if he wasn't satisfied with the result, he would be in trouble. He turned to the commoner and ordered him to take it from his master, and MC excitedly ran to Hugo, asking him to get the item he had prepared. Hugo gave it to him and they nodded slightly at each other. Lucien took the vial and, throwing it into the air with all his might, said that now he would deliver it where it needed to be. Philip became agitated and exclaimed, "What the hell is he doing? Does he even understand what this is?" A knife flew into the vial, the tip broke the glass and magic began to burst out, glowing brightly. The captain of the guard ordered Philip to hide behind him, and then the magic inside the vial exploded. Lucien and Hugo turned away from the light, shielding their eyes, while everyone else was blinded by a bright flash that extended even beyond the tavern. Then everything suddenly went out, the bright light blinding them. Philip fell to his knees in panic and covered his head with his hands, calling for the guards, but no one answered. He began cursing, threatening to scold them, and in panic, he cried out. Why was no one answering him? His knight called out to him, and he opened his eyes, excitedly calling out to him and asking for protection. Because of the recent flash, everything was blurry in his vision, and only silhouettes were visible. When his vision finally cleared, he realized what had happened. His knight, clutching the wound on his neck, told him to run. They had betrayed them. After that, he collapsed to the floor, and Philip looked at him in horror, and then looked around and saw that all the knights were killed. The Black Lion, Nixon, finished off the last of them, and the maids ran screaming. Philip also screamed in fear, and MC thought the flash of the magic stone emitted a bright light upon impact. It's expensive and difficult to store, so it's rarely used, but there's nothing better for instantly blinding an enemy. And yet to think, they killed all of the Marquise's guards in an instant. The squad leader approached him and reported that all potential threats had been successfully eliminated. They will escort the women and this man, who seems to be in charge here. Lucien swallowed nervously, remembering his father's words, now understanding the burden of one who occupies this position. Philip screamed in fear, telling them not to approach. Do they even know who he is? He is a nobleman, the fourth son of Logran. His voice trembled with fear, and the Black Lion said that His Grace, Archduke Valdek, would decide his fate. Let him surrender peacefully. Philip nervously clenched his teeth and wondered if that disguised peasant was a scion of the Valdek family. If so, he must absolutely not be captured here. He turned to the maids and shouted, "What the hell are they doing there?" He then called the guards outside, but no one answered there either, so he asked, "Is everyone there dead too?" MC had already thought it was all over, but suddenly Philip called out to Felicia, and his gaze immediately changed. Philip said that he allowed her to take the sword, that she could handle it. Felicia gently pushed the maids aside, walked up to the sword, kicked it up, and deftly grabbed it. Lucien thought it couldn't be. The same face and a similar name. Even her aura changed the moment she took up the sword. The sword demon Felix. Was it really him? Philip immediately threw himself at her feet and, grabbing the hem of her dress, began to beg her to get him out of here. If she does this, and he does everything she wants, he promises, no one will reproach her again for her mother's low origins. She remained silent, and he asked her to say at least a word. Didn't she exist to protect him? She ordered him to shut up if he wanted to live. She confidently pointed her sword at the enemies and added that she was already sick of his stupidity. Nixon said it was incredible. Just think. He was hiding behind a woman, having lost the last drops of pride. He turned to her and said that he respected her will to win, but she should not rush to certain death for the sake of foolish bravado. This is the mercy he shows to a woman and a child. She remained silent, and he understood the choice she had made. After that, he reached her in one lunge, pointed the tip of his sword at her face, just a little more, and it would have pierced her eye. But she saw everything in slow motion, catching his every tiny movement and breath. Thanks to this, she blocked his blow, diverting his sword upward. Lightning fast changed her stance and jumped to strike him. The last thing he saw was his reflection on the blade. It seemed he didn't even have time to do anything. She was so fast. MC was surprised. Her reaction speed bordered on precognition, her unconventional and sweeping movements. There was no doubt this was the demon Felix. Even before, his graceful manners were completely out of place in the world of mercenaries. Felix always stood out for his slender figure and delicate features. Now everything was clear to him. Illegitimate daughter. Felicia ran away from her family and lived under the guise of a man named Felix. The Black Lion wiped the blood from his face and said that if he had been even a moment late with his defense, his head would have already rolled on the floor. He still had a lot to learn. He had underestimated her, not even noticing her hidden fangs. He would humble his pride and treat her as an equal opponent. After these words, he released his aura, and Felicia became nervous. She understood that this master was head and shoulders above her, and she definitely couldn't handle him now. She shouldn't even rely on blind luck now. Moreover, there was a swordsman of the same level on the second floor, not to mention one who surpassed even them. She had no chance of survival, but since this was her final blow, she would deliver it without regret. The Black Lion said that it was astonishing that she didn't hesitate even in such a hopeless situation, and besides, she boldly faced Nixon's murderous bloodlust. Raymond meanwhile noticed something. Blood dripped from Nixon's wound. They both braced themselves, then rushed towards each other, their gazes and blades clashing. But suddenly Lucian ordered them both to stop. Because of this, they were distracted, and Nixon immediately retreated, and MC firmly said that this was enough. He would not tolerate any more bloodshed. Nixon was indignant, after all. He himself gave them complete freedom of action. If they left her alive, she would become a serious threat to House Valdek. Lucian asked, had he forgotten who granted him this power? He understood his concerns perfectly well. But if they continued, someone would inevitably die. He approached Felicia and introduced himself to her, saying that as the person in charge of this mission, he wanted to make her an offer. They would settle this matter with a duel. If he lost, he would allow her to leave unharmed. But if she lost, she would have to lay down her arms and surrender. He smiled confidently, and she was surprised that he would offer her such a thing. Philip exclaimed, why was she hesitating? Let her quickly agree to his proposal. The only thing she needed to think about was his safety. Didn't he feel at all sorry for his brother, who was forced to endure such hardships because of these incompetent idiots? Let her prove to him that, unlike them, she was truly useful. Let her prove to them that she was different from her mother. She clutched her sword, not daring to object, but MC ordered him to shut up. They were not the kind of people a scumbag like him could speak about so frivolously. Let him no longer insult those who died trying to protect him, nor Felicia. If he continued yapping, he would rip out his tongue. He addressed everyone present and declared that he took full responsibility for the outcome of what was about to happen. Even if by some chance he lost, he hoped that everyone would keep their word. After that, he turned to Felicia and said that he, the third son of House Valdek, was putting his name on the line and challenging her to a duel. Let her draw her sword for her own sake. Meanwhile, Nixon asked the commander if he was really going to just stand and watch. Although he wasn't giving it his all, since his goal was simply to incapacitate her, she not only deflected the sword, but was even able to wound him. Judging by her stance and mana control, it was obvious that she had no training. But that was nonsense. She has outstanding talent and incredible instincts. With her current level of skill, the third young master will never be able to match her. The young master's courage and judgment are impressive, but combat prowess is something else entirely. He needed to make a decision. Raymond said he was of the same opinion, only this time he wanted to simply observe the situation. The moment the third young master took his sword for a duel, he told him exactly what he understood when they crossed swords. This mysterious talent of the girl with the sword and her exceptional eyes. The third young master sees everything perfectly and is aware of his capabilities. They will watch and find out what he is trying to achieve. Felicia, meanwhile, thought that Lucien Valdek was not at all like the other nobles she knew. He did not stop at disguising himself as a personal servant and scouting out Logran's forces. He himself was entering a seemingly unnecessary duel. She cannot fully understand all his true intentions, but she is sure of one thing: he is no match for her. She pursed her lips and said that she will never forget his mercy. Since he gave her, a simple servant, a chance, if she defeats him, she will accept the shame and quietly leave this place. He said that if he wins, she will go with him to Kelheim. It seemed she had already made up her mind. She confidently pointed her sword at him, and he did the same. She didn't want to leave him with any unnecessary wounds, and thought about incapacitating him with one blow, after which, her gaze changed and she rushed into battle. She jumped up, swung her sword, already thinking that this was the end, but then her eyes widened in surprise. He blocked her blow. He swung his sword, forcing her to retreat, and she thought that the young master's breathing and reflexes were completely unable to keep up with her movements. So how did he manage to block her sword? Before she could notice, he was in front of her, and she managed to block the blow. MC began to press her, and thought that she was probably completely stunned due to the situation she was now forced into. She was exhausted due to the endless mana control during the fight with the Black Lion. Even if she saved some strength just in case, the gap between her and him was too great now. But he knows her better than she knows herself. Her habits, her weaknesses, and even the trajectory of her sword. Their past encounter was brief, but they fought fiercely with swords and learned a lot from each other. If there's someone his body remembers perfectly, it is her. At that moment, the broken part of the sword flew into the air, which amazed everyone and scared Philip. Of course, the time they spent together did not last long. Nevertheless, she spared no effort in teaching him the art of the sword, even knowing that one day they could become enemies. Thanks to this, he was able to survive. And now, her broken sword fell with a clang. Felicia caught her breath, staring at him stunned, and he thought that now he would at least repay her a little for the debt that remained from those times. At night, the squad returned home. Sigmund stood on the balcony surveying his possessions and asked Raymond how everything went. Lucian, this boy, does he have what it takes to be a pillar of strength for the Valdek family in the future? He told him he had an unyielding core, and the Archduke said he thought he would breathe a sigh of relief, simply to hear he hadn't been led astray. But he heard something unexpected. Raymond asked, was his guess correct then? Sigmund said it was not for nothing that he had sent them on this mission. It is still too early to draw conclusions about the succession to the throne. Raymond lowered his head, admitting he had said too much, and he said everything was fine. If the report wasn't exaggerated, then it was truly impressive. He glanced at the package in his hand and smiled, then patted Raymond on the shoulder and said that at least for his sake, he could play along. By the way, They hadn't had a drink in a long time. They just brought some excellent wine. Would he join him? It's his favorite variety, so he should like it. Raymond chuckled and said he was afraid he would soon regret those words. Even a night wouldn't be enough to hear the whole story of this mission. Having completed the mission in Vestra, MC set off for Kelheim in the morning. As soon as their duel ended, Felicia lost consciousness due to the effects of excessive mana control. To help her recover, he sent Felicia and the maids to the nearest town. He forced the guy who pretended to be a nobleman until the very end to dig graves for his vassals with his own hands, hoping that he would understand the weight of the lives he had taken. He closed his eyes, enjoying the sun and the breeze and the silence, which was quickly broken by Philip. He shouted at Hugo that he would not forgive him for this. Does he think he will survive after daring to betray them? He called out to Lucian and said that he demanded to be treated as a prisoner of war. How could a son of House Logran be treated like this? Did he really want to make their house his enemy? MC glanced at him with disgust, realizing that he still hadn't realized the gravity of what he had done, and said that he would give him one piece of advice. If he wanted to live even a little longer, he'd better watch his mouth. This was a place where even his powerful father wouldn't dare to tread, because this was the heart of Valdek, Kelheim. They finally arrived in the city, and as soon as the gates opened, he saw something unexpected. People lined the road, greeting and praising him for exposing the atrocities of House Logran and capturing their leader alive. Everyone greeted him with smiles and joy. Hugo was confused and asked, "What the hell is going on here?" Lucian chuckled quietly and said that he had indeed asked in his letter for the opportunity to expose the atrocities of House Logran, but it seemed his father had decided to support him fully. He turned to Hugo and told him to keep his head up and accept this. This was his first major achievement. They passed by people showering them with thanks, and Sigmund watched from the tower. He said that it seemed he too was getting old, since he staged a triumphal procession only because his son asked. Edwin smiled and asked if he had not accomplished a great feat, and flawlessly at that. He considered this procession well-deserved. Moreover, young Master Lucian's letter was not simply an attempt to strengthen his position. It was a move intended to demonstrate the resolve of the Valdek family to the people, and send a strong signal to the imperial family and House Logran. He surely foresaw this and therefore gave his permission. Sigmund said that the Empire had been unusually restless lately. Even the sun, which seemed eternal, even Lionclaws, which seemed indestructible, crack over time. To avoid being swept away by this flood, they must sharpen their blades sharper than ever. Returning home, MC collapsed onto the bed and sighed heavily, thinking that he felt alive again. He couldn't believe he missed this so much, having quickly become accustomed to noble life. The Duke had scheduled a separate report for him for the evening, so he had some free time. The event had borne far more fruit than he had expected. He had secured Felicia earlier than planned, staged a triumphal procession to dispel the bad reputation in one fell swoop, given Hugo powerful motivation for further action, and even established a connection with the Black Lion. Scattered pieces of the puzzle were fitting together to form a step on his path. One step that was slowly bringing him closer to the dragon's throne. He smiled and remembered his fellow mercenaries. If those guys saw him now, they would be scared to death. He decided to stop dreaming and prepare for the next step. While Felicia recovered from the duel, while Hugo trained, he decided to see what he could squeeze out of the Duke. He went to the dining hall, where Sigmund was already waiting for him. They began to eat, and he said that his first mission had been remarkably successful. They compared records and confirmed that the captured child was indeed the Marquise's heir. This is the most irrefutable proof of all. He did an excellent job. He was very happy and said that it was all thanks to him lending him the Black Lion's help. By the way, what will happen to Philip Logran now? The Marquise will not sit idly by to see his own child die before his eyes. The Archduke said that they will find out in time. Bernhard Logran is a snake man. He will not hesitate to sacrifice his own child for the sake of his family. One heir is enough for him to continue the line. Because of this, Lucian became nervous, and his father said that he had nothing to worry about. He had already done more than enough. Now let him say what he wants as a reward for this mission. It was not for nothing that he sent him a letter. He doubts that he will limit himself to just a triumphant return. He laughed awkwardly and looked away, saying that he had asked him so directly about it that he even felt a little uncomfortable. But since the conversation had already started, he would dare to voice his request. And he decided to start with Hugo, who had distinguished himself so much this time. But before he could finish, his father said that it was impossible. MC called out to him in confusion, saying that he hadn't even finished, and he was going to ask for a knighthood for him, wasn't he? He had helped them this time, but his past ties with the Marquise's family could not be ignored. If he hadn't lured him away, he would have stayed with them to the end. Lucian tried to dissuade him, saying that this was just speculation. The fact is, he was on his side and had proven himself excellent. His father gave him a stern look and told him to stop. A knight must earn his honor himself by performing feats that no one can dispute. Does he really believe he has such qualities? MC looked down in disappointment. He knew he would say that, but it seemed like a final refusal. His father said that if he needed gold coins, he would give him chests full, and if necessary, he would provide him with a new name, but he would not become a knight. At least, not now. Lucian silently apologized to Hugo. They would have to wait for another chance. He did not argue with his father anymore and said that he was right. It seemed he had rushed. Sigmund told him in that case to ask for something else, this time not so exorbitant. MC grinned and said that then he would have one very modest request. Let him allow Felicia to meet with the Holy Swordsman. His father was very surprised by this request. Sometime later, in a prison camp, Felicia sat in the room and thought, this is not an ordinary prison, but a special institution for nobility. She was sent here with a servant, but they are fed and treated. What is their purpose? She remembered how she had been treated before and thought that maybe it was for the best. At least she had managed to escape from this hellish place. She remembered the duel with Lucian, how she wished she could hold a sword in her hands at least once more before she died. If she could dream of more, then she would like to fight him one more time. Although, of course, this was complete nonsense. MC entered her room and said that according to the healer, she had problems with mana control. She was suffering from severe exhaustion and fatigue. Was she feeling better? Was she strong enough to hold a sword again? She was surprised by his arrival, but now she was only concerned about his words about the sword. He asked if she was going to stay here forever. Surprisingly, she clearly liked life in prison. He took bread from the plate and took a bite, saying that he hadn't put so much effort into bringing her here for this. He would ask directly, didn't she want to reveal her talent with the sword here? He had no intention of letting her remain an ordinary swordswoman. He would recommend her to become the apprentice of the swordsman Ison. She gritted her teeth and hissed. Was he mocking her now? She exclaimed that it was absurd in itself for a simple servant and a woman like her to become a swordswoman, much less the apprentice of a holy swordsman. Her status was low, but she was not so stupid as to forget her place. Lucian realized that he had been a bit hasty. Her reaction was quite natural. Despite being the illegitimate child of the Marquise, she was not even allowed to hold a sword, let alone learn how to wield one. Instead, she suffered from the envy and persecution of her siblings. The result was the sword demon Felix, who escaped from the house of Logran. He said that he understood why she did not trust him, so she should think carefully before making a decision. Confused, she asked, what did he mean? He said that this meant that he was giving her freedom of choice. He headed for the exit and said at last that she could leave today. So he would say only one thing, let her not give up the sword. She becomes herself only when she holds a sword in her hand. His words pierced her heart, because even her own family had taken the sword from her. She excitedly jumped out of bed and called out to him, asking if she really had the right to this. Could she devote herself only to the sword, throwing away everything else? He answered her that if her heart desired it, he swears on his name that she could do it. When he was still a mercenary, he asked Felix what his dream was. Others dream of living in luxury and honor, but for him, it seemed to him, everything was different. For him, becoming a knight was not a problem. Captain of the Knights, or maybe a noble title? He answered that he had never really thought about it, but if he could only wish for one thing, he would want to devote himself solely to the sword, discarding everything else. That would be enough for him. After that, MC went with her to the training grounds, where he saw his father. He approached him and asked him, confused, what brought him here? He answered that, after all, this was a meeting with the Holy Sword. Did he really think he would miss such an important event? He turned his gaze to the people he had brought, and they immediately bowed to him in greeting. Sigmund asked, so he is Hugo? He looked up at him with a worried look, and he said that he had heard that he had done well this time. However, his past sins were too great to overlook them for the sake of one merit. He immediately lowered his head guiltily and said that there was no justification for his actions, and Sigmund said that, despite knowing this perfectly well, his lord had asked to grant him a knighthood. Moreover, for this, he had given up his own reward. Lucian became agitated, asking what he was talking about, and Hugo thought in surprise, was he asking him for this for his sake? He really intended to keep his word. The Archduke said he was afraid of disappointing him, but he rejected his request. He believed he was not yet ready to shoulder such a burden. Therefore, let him continue to work hard, proving his loyalty with his deeds, so that one day he himself would grant him this title. He would eagerly await that day. Hugo confidently answered him that he would certainly live up to his expectations. After that, Sigmund moved on to Felicia and said that since she grew up in that place, she should understand everything perfectly. The question of the heir had not yet been decided, and Lucian was taking a great risk by standing up for a simple servant. If she could not prove her worth, rumors would spread that he was a pathetic fool, blinded by female beauty. So let her answer him. Does she think she is worth such risks? She mumbled, not knowing what to say, and MC stood up for her. With a confident smile, he told his father that she was certainly worth the risk, and would more than pay for it. Let everyone doubt him now and think his choice stupid. Perhaps even Felicia herself was unsure of herself, but everything would change today. Soon everyone would understand that she was a true diamond, bound only by birth and gender. He turned to her and whispered, why was she frozen? Let her say that she was ready. While she spoke excitedly, he thought he had not been mistaken. The Grand Duke was waiting for them here for a reason. He wanted to personally see the vassals his son had chosen. As if wishing for a tailwind to support the first flap of his child's wings, he came here in person. The Archduke said that since he was so sure of it, they would now check everything. He went to the training ground and told them to prepare to meet the Holy Sword. Lucian bowed, thanking his father for his blessing. Aizen arrived soon after, stroking his beard with interest, and noting that not only the third young master had arrived today, but also his lordship. Sigmund said this was an important event for their family, and as a knight, he simply couldn't contain his curiosity. He asked him to judge her with all severity, without making any concessions for the sake of his son. MC said he wanted to ask him the same, otherwise their agreement with him would be meaningless. Aizen remembered what he had said and turned to the nervous Felicia, saying that since they both insisted, he would conduct the trial with all seriousness. He approached the girl, and her heart pounded faster with excitement. In front of her was indeed a holy sword. It was simply standing next to her, but she felt how the very atmosphere around it had changed. She said she was a great honor to meet him. She wanted to introduce herself, but he said he didn't need names. He thrust the wooden sword into the floor with his power, and said that her blade should speak for her, and they would leave the introduction for later. Let her try to pull out this wooden sword. Lucian thought that the test had begun. He concentrated mana on the tip of the wooden sword and drove it into the floor almost half a meter. Felicia's physical strength alone wouldn't be enough, but if she used mana, she would cope without a problem. However, there was something else. Meanwhile, she took the sword and thought that she wouldn't have a second chance. She needed to act reliably, just like Philip did. If she concentrated mana in her hands, she could do it. She managed to pull the sword out without much effort on the first try, which made her immensely happy. She asked the swordsman with a smile what she should do next, but he only told her with a gloomy expression that this was enough. There was no need to continue. She was surprised and asked what he was talking about. He said that he could see from her face that she didn't understand anything, and she said, confused, that she had simply drawn the sword as he ordered. He took her wrist and said that the reason was obvious. Her internal channels were in terrible condition because she had avoided circulation out of fear of pain. The way she controlled mana was completely disregarding the limits of her body. This was typical behavior of those who rely too much on their talent, another manifestation of arrogance. Considering that she, as a woman, was able to cross blades with a black lion, she certainly had talent, but unfortunately, this would not fix her character flaws. Would such an explanation satisfy her? Let her remember her teacher's instructions and carefully consider her behavior. First of all, she needed to learn to listen to other people's advice. She said that she had never had the opportunity to study with a mentor, and to her shame, she had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. What is circulation? How to control mana? She only watched her brother from afar and tried to imitate him. She is completely ignorant about this, and so she begs him to teach her. He was surprised and asked, does she mean to say that she learned everything without anyone's help, just by observing? That's impossible. After all, she just used mana to draw the sword. She told him that she simply remembered how her brother did it during their sparring and repeated it. Every time the strong aura in her brother's body began to pulse more strongly, she felt the weight and speed of his sword change. Aizen was even more surprised and thought, what kind of nonsense is she talking? The flows of mana inside someone else's body cannot be seen with just the eyes. Even he is not capable of this without direct physical contact. Besides, the sensation of mana is akin to a sixth sense. How could she reproduce it with just an effort of will? He glanced at Lucian, his stunned gaze asking who this girl was. He smiled contentedly. After all, he had told him that he would bring him incredible talent, the true embodiment of swordsmanship. After that, he decided to see her abilities in battle. He stood still, and she quickly moved around him, trying to find the right moment to attack. At one point, she lunged at him, got behind him, and swung her sword, but her blade collided with his. He said that she had too many wasted movements. Her blade was dull, and her resolve was even weaker. And this was all her despair could do. She gritted her teeth in frustration, retreated, and thought that she could no longer move, and her sword was completely useless to him. And this despite the fact that the holy swordsman had not even moved from his place. So, this was the pinnacle of swordsmanship. An unbridgeable chasm that she could not even comprehend right now, but she wouldn't give up so easily. She pulled herself together, cut a smooth slab out of the stone floor, tossed it into the air, and rushed toward the swordsman. She lightly touched the stone slab with the tip of her sword, accelerating, and Aizen saw her fighting spirit, which didn't fade even in front of a wall. Freedom of thought, unfettered by experience. But that still wasn't enough. She needed to let it all out, all the resentment she was holding back. He waved his hand, drawing a smooth line on the slab, and it immediately broke in half, revealing Felicia. She rushed at the swordsman, but it was as if she were meeting a formidable beast, causing her to shudder. But despite his terrifying aura, she gathered her strength and swung her sword with a cry, causing the old man to smile faintly. A bright flash of light flashed across the arena from her strike. While father and son watched, Sigmund asked, does he know which swordsman is reliable? The one who has learned the price of hardship firsthand, the fundamentals honed through endless repetition, the one who has tempered himself in battles where a second's hesitation means death. It's cruel, But that's what a swordsman's skill is based on. He's always surrounded himself with such people. But in this world, there are those who can easily leap over the towers others spent their entire lives building. Those who appear to the world like a scorching sun, like a wave that engulfs everything in its path. Those whose talent inspires awe, like this girl. To stop Felicia's strike, Aizen had to grab her sword with his bare hand. Sigmund said he made the right choice. His son said that if he hadn't believed in her and given her a chance, that spark might have simply died out. In this world, countless talents remain unnoticed, simply because they never get the chance. Aizen, meanwhile, saw her unwavering gaze fixed on the sword. She was a child born with the destiny to wield a sword, no matter what trials lay along the way. This girl's eyes were truly capable of seeing it. Beyond common sense, the sword's path stretches to infinity. He asked her to state her name again. Today she had proven everything with her sword, and now no one would dare doubt her name. Let her state her name with pride. She looked at him in surprise, then put the sword down and told him that her name was Felicia. Her mother had no surname. Her father, the head of the Logren clan, did not allow her to bear his surname, so the only name she had was Felicia. He noted that she had endured it all with fortitude. He named her Felicia Brightener, and said that from now on, that was her name. From today on, he accepts her as his adopted daughter and will teach her everything he knows, from fencing to noble etiquette. It won't be easy. There will be no easy way. Will she be able to endure it? Honored with such honor, she knelt before him and shed a tear of happiness, and he patted her on the back and told her that he was a stubborn old man who had been quick to judge her and hurled harsh words. The day will come when his stubbornness and views will collide with her free soul. When that happens, will she be able to convince him with her sword? He, in turn, will try to understand his true feelings through her blade. The paths they walked were different, but their blades point in the same direction. So from this day on, they will move forward together.